Although Bishop Coyle had around 20,000 shares of his own personal stock and could have sold every share of it then and there for $10 a share, he wouldn't sell any of it. He tried to tell them that it would blow over, that it was not the big strike that would not blow over. But no one wanted to listen to him. They wanted to buy the stock. Therefore, many of them searched elsewhere until they found a stockholder who was willing to sell for $10 a share, and there was much of it that changed hands at that price. When the excitement blew over and things calmed down again, the buyers who had purchased employee stock from Bishop Coyle at $5 a share were given as much again stock as they had purchased without cost, because Coyle did not want this to be such an expensive lesson to them. But when the next excitement comes, he told them, the people will rush to our house much more excited than ever, and they would fill the house, and the lawn, and even the road in front of the house, and on down the road, causing a traffic jam for quite some distance away. This excitement will not blow over, but it will be permanent, though the people could no longer buy stock from the company at that time. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 48. The mine was then experiencing a boom, much the same as the rest of the country. It was the year 1929. Early in July of that year, some visitors came to John's home, which was a small adobe house in Spanish Fork. John was renting this house from his stake president, Henry Gardner, who was also his banker. Bishop Coyle was absent on this occasion, so they interviewed Mrs. Coyle, asking her how she felt about her husband's dreams, if she thought they were true or not. Yes, John has had quite a few dreams already proved to be true, so I don't see why this one about the mine shouldn't prove to be true. Also, she said. Has he had anything unusual given to him lately? Yes, he saw that a financial crash would come over the nation just 4 months from now. That was June 29th. Does Mr. Gardner, your banker, know about this? Yes, the other day John went down to see Mr. Gardner and told him about it and advised him to get as many of his loans back in as he could before October, because that was when the trouble would come. Would you mind telling us, suggested one of the visitors, if your husband has ever had one of these unusual dreams that has ever failed to prove true? I have never seen one of them fail yet, she affirmed. An interesting sequence to Bishop Coyle's informing Mr. Gardner, the banker, of the forthcoming market crash was as follows. As the 4 months rolled by and nothing of the sort had as yet happened, Henry Gardner hailed Bishop Coyle into his bank as he was passing by, saying that he had a bone to pick with him. He then, rather in a facetious mood, upbraided Coyle for being a false prophet. He pointed out how he had taken his advice and had not extended some of the loans which now appeared to have been good risks. And now no sign of a market crash. What did Coyle have to say for himself now? Bishop Coyle faced up to him squarely and insisted that his prediction still stood without any changes and that Mr. Gardner was jumping the gun on him, for he still had 1 more day before the 4 months were up, as it was only October 28th. He could call him back after tomorrow if he had any bone to pick with him. But this dream was true, make no mistake about that. Needless to say, the following day, October 29th, the newspapers carried big headlines about the history-making stock market crash, while Henry Gardner had good cause to marvel at his most unusual tenant. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, pages 48 to 49. Picture here: the bishop had received many important dreams concerning the mine and also of national events. But he also received instructions from the Lord concerning his own family. One time he received instructions for a brother who learned a hard lesson but gained new respect for the bishop. Bishop was carried in the spirit into the spirit world, where he saw beauty beyond anything he had ever seen on earth. The homes were neat, well arranged and surrounded with gardens of flowers that defied description, rare and brilliant colors not seen on earth. As he walked up the path toward a T-shaped house, his father, who had been dead a number of years, came out on the walk and greeted him with a hearty welcome. He said, "John, I want you to go back to earth and teach the gospel to your brothers and sisters, and see that they repent and go to the temple, and be sealed for time and eternity. Tell Harry if he doesn't quit his profanity and getting drunk, he will get an awful shaking up." John came back and went to work teaching and working with them, and they all were obedient, but Harry, who was stubborn and unwilling. John said to him, "I have warned you these 3 times, and if you don't straighten up, you will be punished with an awful shaking up." The warning was like pouring water on a duck. He paid no heed until one day he was going up the trail in Flat Canyon taking supplies up to his sheep camp. He was walking, leading the pack horses through the oaks, when suddenly an unseen power seized him and shook him with such fury that when he clung to the oaks, it tore the flesh off his hands. That changed his whole life. He quit drinking and went to the temple and had his wife and children all sealed to him for eternity. Relief Mine Story, J. Young, page 4. One of the Hanks family living near Salem met the bishop one morning. Bishop asked him if he could help him for the rest of the day, but Hanks replied that he was in the middle of some work with his sheep. He just couldn't spare the time. However, if the bishop couldn't locate anyone else to help him, then he would go. The bishop asked Hanks if he was selling his sheep, to which Hanks replied that he was going to wait until fall to sell them. The bishop walked over to the gate and then stopped. He turned back to Hanks and said, "You had better sell them before fall, because if you don't, you'll be lucky to get $3 a head." The bishop opened the gate, went through, and turned back to Hanks and added, "And then you'll have to leave their bells on them." That fall, when Hanks was getting ready to sell his sheep, the market plunged. He couldn't find a buyer for them anywhere. Finally, he located someone up near Bountiful who said he would give him only $3 a head. They prepared a bill of sale, and the man was just about to put his pen to the paper, but stopped and said, "And you'll have to leave the sheep bells on." Nearly 10 years before World War I, Bishop Coyle predicted the involvement of the United States in a world war. He also predicted the involvement of the 145th Field Artillery, which was composed of Utah boys. He declared that he saw a dream that the 145th would be called to the front but would never see action. When the war began, many remembered the prophecy that it was a fulfillment of the bishop's dream. Many of the parents of the boys who had sons in the 145th Artillery began to take comfort in the rest of the prophecy that their boys would not see action. His prediction of the war and the 145th made wide circulation since the war was uppermost on everyone's mind, especially those who had boys in the 145th Artillery. Then one morning the newspaper headlines bore the news that the 145th Field Artillery had received orders to move up to the front lines. They would encounter an engagement with the enemy that same day. This was a blow to many of the parents who had trusted in the bishop's prediction. A man by the name of Fred Squires from Salt Lake City, an active stockholder in the mine, read the paper with shock. He was so disturbed about this prophecy failing that he went to the mine and found Bishop Coyle to show him the paper. When the bishop saw the headlines, he calmly said, "Fred, they are telling a lie. The 145th will not see action on the front lines. The war will be over by the time they reach the front lines." Fred was holding a newspaper with the date of November 11, 1918. Strangely enough, the armistice had already been signed, and it had caused the cancellation of the 145th Field Artillery from going into action. By the time Fred Squires arrived back in Salt Lake City, the news of the armistice had already been received. While compiling information for the first edition of this book, I noticed a prophecy attributed to Bishop Coyle that was recorded by Norman Pierce. Since Pierce was no longer alive for confirmation and since I personally had never heard Bishop Coyle give such a prophecy, I decided not to include it in my book. Furthermore, I thought it sounded too fantastic and impossible to ever be fulfilled. It is important to record in this revised edition this very significant prophecy and its fulfillment: muddy water in the streets like rivers. About this time Bishop Coyle had another of his same prophetic dreams which I heard him relate, saying, "It looks like it won't be long now before we'll be having some of the big troubles we've been expecting." I saw in a dream the other night that muddy water would flow in the streets like rivers in almost every community from one end of the state to the other. When it comes, it's going to cause a lot of trouble for a lot of people around here. It will be the beginning of really big troubles. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, 1958, page 90. Years later, in 1983, rains began to pour over the state of Utah. They continued until water literally ran down the streets of cities from one end of the state to the other. Some small towns were literally abandoned until the water receded. Over half of the counties asked for federal emergency assistance. The Agriculture and Health Committee was told that Utah's farms and ranches had sustained an estimated $57.7 million loss. SL Tribune Utah floods, page 62. There were $63 million in road damages in the state. The total estimate for damages from the rains and too rapidly melting snow came to over $200 million. Picture. Bishop Coyle's prophecies were becoming a thorn in the side of many of the general authorities of the LDS Church. There was a continual fulfillment of prophecies and predictions from the mine on the hill, yet a famine of such gifts existed with the leaders of the church in Salt Lake City. The gap between some of the church leaders and Bishop Coyle was growing further and further apart. Yet more and more people were receiving inspiration of their own, that the mine was the work of God. One unusual testimony came from a man by the name of Parley Alton Waters. Waters said an angel came one night and gave him some very interesting information which he put into a poem and later gave to Bishop Coyle. I stood at the open portal of a tunnel peculiarly grand. The patience required in its digging was famed throughout the land, and one of an ancient nation stood guard at the entry there. Hallowed, though stern, was his visage, snow white were his beard and hair. With this guide I entered the chamber, its cavernous depths to explore, and I felt as I hastened forward, as I never had felt before, for I knew here was perfect safety, and that I had nothing to fear, for those with motives untainted were protected in working here. Near a winze at the end of the tunnel stood another of a solemn mien, stern-visaged and armed with a saber, as he at the portal had been. As we passed onward and downward, each landing was guarded the same, till by curious motives prompted, I asked, "Friend, what is thy name? And why dost thou and thy fellows stand guard in these workings old? Perchance, in the depths below us, there are uncounted treasures of gold?" To my query he thus made answer, "Son of earth, thou hast rightly said, for I and my brothers are remnants of a nation long since dead. Ages gone, when I dwelt among mortals, these mountains were teeming with wealth, and our Father was granting my people wisdom, great riches and health. But in the pride of their hearts, they forsook him, and worshipped Mammon alone, till their sins reached upward to heaven, and earth 'neath corruption did groan. 'Twas then that the spirit ceased striving, and left them in darkness once more. For every man's hand smote his neighbor, and destruction was rapid and sure. And when iniquity ripened, the earth in convulsions did lie, and the wealth of these mountains was hidden from their evil and covetous eye. The wealth of the mountains of Ephraim, thus saith the Lord, is mine, and to all who partake of their fatness, I give by right most divine." Here, then, was preserved for a people prepared to accomplish his will, the wealth which the Father hath hidden beneath this most notable hill. We are guarding this wealth in the workers, that corruption shall not allure the toiler who enters these caverns with motives unselfish and pure. For the Father's purpose will ripen, though derision and scoffers abound, and coming from sources unthought of, dark clouds will cover them around. I awoke from my sleep and my dreaming, and sought my companion again. But naught did I see but the mountain, and the place where my visit had been. But I knew that this wealth that was hidden from a nation now under the sod must be used as my guided bidden, for the glorification of God. Brother Waters thought he was to open and work this mine, but he got no direction as to where and how to find it till one day, while in Spanish Fork someone asked him to go to the annual Dream Mine meeting that was being held on the hill that day. He went gladly. When he saw the mine tunnel, he was greatly surprised and thrilled, for it was the very thing the messenger showed him in the dream. He took the poem out of his pocket, handed it to Bishop Coyle and said, "Here, Bishop, this belongs to you. It's your work and mission to bring relief to the people in time of great need and trouble." Bishop Coyle gladly received the wonderful new testimony to the divinity of his great mission and work. A Relief Mine Story, J. Young, page 6. Men were receiving testimonies from God that the work of the mine was divinely inspired, yet men like Talmage declared it to be from the evil one. Men in the church declared themselves to be prophets, seers, and revelators, yet they failed to produce any revelations. Bishop Coyle never made any pretense to being a prophet, yet he was able to say the Lord showed me, and then make a prophecy which was soon fulfilled in every respect. Who really was a prophet, and who was being directed by the spiritual gifts of prophecy and revelation? Every man had to ask these questions, and then seek the answer for himself. Heber C. Kimball prophesied, "To meet the difficulties that are coming, it will be necessary for you to have a knowledge of the truth of this work for yourselves. The difficulties will be of such a character that the man or woman who does not possess this personal knowledge or witness will fall. If you have not got the testimony, live right and call upon the Lord and cease not till you attain it. If you do not, you will not stand." Remember these sayings, for many of you will live to see them fulfilled. The time will come when no man nor woman will be able to endure on borrowed light. Each will have to be guided by the light within himself. Life of Heber C. Kimball, pages 460 to 461. It requires the spirit of prophecy to recognize the voice of a prophet. "The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy," said Joseph Smith, and men were now learning by the Holy Ghost that John H. Coyle was inspired of the Lord. One day J. Golden Kimball received word that Bishop Coyle wanted to see him as soon as possible, so he drove right down to the mine. Coyle immediately got into the subject that was causing him considerable distress by saying, "Golden, the Lord showed me in a dream that Joseph Fielding Smith is preparing a conference sermon that is against the dream mine, and the Lord doesn't want him to deliver it. I want you to go up there and tell him not to give that sermon." "Not me," replied Golden. "I'm not going to put my head in the lion's mouth." Coyle grabbed Kimball by the coat collar and said, "Golden, God hates a coward." He looked a little sheepish and replied, "All right, Bishop, I'll tell him, but I don't have any faith that it will do any good." The bishop smiled and retorted, "Don't worry, I'll take care of the faith." Kimball returned to Salt Lake City and went directly to Joseph Fielding Smith's office. Smith was at his desk, so Golden walked over and said, "Brother Smith, you're not supposed to deliver that conference sermon that's against the dream mine." Smith jumped up and shouted, "How did you find out about that sermon?" "I haven't told anyone." Golden replied, "Well, the Lord knows, and he told Bishop Coyle about it." When conference came, Joseph Fielding Smith delivered a sermon, but it made no mention of the dream mine. Carter Grant and some friends visited the Coyle home one evening. The bishop was away, so they asked his wife the following question, "Would you mind telling us," suggested one of our number, "if your husband has ever had one of these PLAIN dreams of which you refer, that has failed to prove out?" "I have never seen one yet," she declared. Statement by Carter E. Grant to James E. Talmage, September 9, 1931, page 12. Although Bishop Coyle's wife never knew of any prophecy to fail, a few people thought he had missed one particular prophecy. Statements made by the bishop would become enlarged or exaggerated by over-enthusiastic believers, or else twisted and warped by his enemies. This misconstrued information caused Bishop Coyle trouble from friends and enemies alike. One prominent story which was circulated and accredited to the bishop as a prophecy was, in reality, never given by him at all. It was to the effect that the mine would come out on August 27, 1946. What actually happened was that the bishop once said that it would be very appropriate and coincidental if the mine should come in on August 27, on the very anniversary of the appearance of the messenger who first called him to that work. By the time the bishop heard how erroneously his statement had been changed, it had spread too far to stop. Years later, some of the stockholders still thought it had been a prophecy, but the bishop never did set a date for the mine to come in. Whenever the bishop related a dream or said the Lord had revealed something to him, the manifestation was always correct, or if it was a prophecy, it always came true. Prophecies and revelations are abundant with details of the famines of the last days. Bishop Coyle also described this food shortage that had been shown to him in dreams. Grain would grow up, as though it would produce a fine crop, but something caused it to shrivel up and become a valueless harvest. Famine would occur all over the world, not only because of crop failures, but because of the troubles and chaos caused by the shutdown of manufacturing and transportation. At that early date, he also said words like these, "By the time we get our ore, the mining districts will be almost at a standstill. These automobiles will get larger and larger until some of them will resemble street cars filled with people." Then, too, I saw the farms all over the country all being mortgaged, and as a relief to the condition, the people were coming to borrow money at a low rate of interest from the Coyle Mining Company. I also saw a large bank belonging to our company standing on a certain corner in Spanish Fork. I have since been shown the corner. Then I saw the hard times beginning to tell upon the treasury of the church, being more depleted than in many years. Then, right in the very midst of all these happenings, with things at their darkest, we began shipping ore, giving a decided relief to the situation. Grant Talmage Statement, September 9, 1931, page 10. A professor at Utah State University, Austin 5, and his wife, heard Bishop Coyle say that Brigham Young stood right down here in Salem and pointed up to this mountain and said, "There's enough gold and silver in that mountain to pave all the streets in Utah County." I've talked to 2 of the 3 witnesses that heard him say so. Saints of Sage and Saddle, Austin, and Alta 5, 1956, page 283. Many people have received testimonies that the mine really does contain valuable ore and other treasures. A man named Erickson wrote, "It was revealed to me by the Holy Ghost that in a deep narrow gorge, in a southeasterly direction from Salt Lake, hidden records are concealed." Visions of the Latter Days, Kraut, 1983 ed. Page 129. Visitors from the other world were not uncommon to Bishop Coyle. He had met and visited with members of his family who had left this earth many years before. Also, other heavenly and holy beings had visited with him, such as Nephi, Mormon, the 3 Nephites, Moses, and also the prophet Joseph Smith. Such a work required special direction, and divinely inspired messengers were on hand to guide and protect it. The mission of Moses was to gather the house of Israel out from among the Gentiles. It required outstanding miracles and plagues to accomplish that feat. Even while they were captives living in bondage to the Egyptians, they had to be separated physically and socially from the Egyptians. They had to begin their own nation. Moses was their deliverer and led them out of their bondage. They had to be taken away from the slavery, the unholy practices, the traditions, financial, military and political corruptions of their captors. When they were delivered away from that power and influence, they were then in a condition favorable to receiving the word and will of the Lord. When the prophet Moses appeared to the bishop, he explained how difficult it had been for him to gather Israel and lead them in the paths of God. He also explained how this mine would someday be used to gather Israel from the nations of the earth, where they are now scattered. They cannot be saved in a scattered condition. Therefore, there would be one like unto Moses who would help in leading and gathering Israel from the temporal and spiritual bondage they are now in. Today Israel must be delivered from the modern bondage of the Gentiles. They must be gathered home to the land and the places the Lord has designated for them. The house of Israel is scattered among the nations of the earth, living and dying in the customs and traditions of Gentiles. They live by the laws of the land in many different nations, rather than by the laws of God. The children of Israel are marrying Gentiles, living in the society of Gentiles, and gradually forsaking the doctrines of God. They must be delivered from bondage again, or they shall die by plagues and wars. No wonder Moses came to Bishop Coyle to explain the work of gathering Israel. It will take wealth and power, not only to bring them back from so many nations, but to support and sustain them when they arrive. Bishop Coyle was told that, when this mine brings forth its riches, it will have such power and influence with the children of Israel, that more of them will come into the fold of Christ than has been accomplished by all the missionaries that have ever traveled the earth since the restoration of the gospel. It is no wonder that Bishop Coyle and his work were so highly esteemed by the Lord. Many spiritual men learned that John Coyle was a true prophet, seer, and revelator. Photo of the Grove. The place where Bishop Coyle made so many famous prophecies. Chapter 10. The White Sentinel. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. Psalms 121 1-2. Photo of the mill building. Travelers driving down Highway 89 or Interstate 15 near Salem, Utah, are often curious, if not impressed, with the large white mill resting against the Loafer Mountain. It stands silent and lonely, but majestic in a modern form of architecture, as it cascades down the contour of the mountain. Spectators often wonder, or inquire as to what it is. It has an interesting history that goes all the way back to the stock market crash of 1929. During that Great Depression, the country suffered because money was so difficult to find. The years of 1930 and 1931 were hard ones for everyone everywhere. In May of 1931, the Dream Mine stockholders celebrated the 37th year since work commenced on the mine by attending their annual outing at the Grove. William A. Jones, the mine's secretary, spoke to the little group gathered there and related some of the numerous prophecies of Bishop Coyle that were being fulfilled. A few that were mentioned were: 1. Cars and trucks were now the size of boxcars traveling on the highways. 2. Property was now mortgaged to the limit. 3. The mining industry was paralyzed. 4. The Utah Lake was at its lowest known level. 5. And 4 years of draft were already partially fulfilled. The stockholders expressed gratitude for being a part of such an inspired work. They were happy to know that God was mindful enough of them that He informed them of many major events before they came to pass. But the bishop warned them that these were times that would be only a trifle compared to the famines, shortages and the financial collapse that was yet to come. The chaos of the early 30s was merely a taste of what should take place in America's future. These saints were being warned to prepare for those difficult days that were ahead. But the conditions at that time were bad enough, as the following quotation will verify. Nobody had a nickel. Nobody would invest. Mining was particularly hard hit. World-famous mines in the district were closing down or on the verge of it. Mining stock could hardly be given away. Things looked black for the Dream Mine. For 7 weeks Coyle couldn't meet the payroll. Dreamers wanted returns. They wanted cash instead of promises. Coyle explained there was plenty of ore, but it was this special ore, with all these metals mixed up in it. You heat it and black smoke comes off, all those metals burning up. There was no plant in existence that could handle it. "We've got to build our own plant," Coyle told his directors. They threw up their hands in horror. Coyle saw it was no use talking with them. "I was afraid to tell him," he admits. Time in the Dream Mine, Samuel W. Taylor Esquire, November 1943. But the bishop had to make a special announcement to the stockholders. They were told that a huge processing mill would be built on the mountain. But since they were in the depths of a depression, such a project seemed impossible. Undertaking such a massive piece of construction seemed almost incredible even to the bishop. In a dream, John was shown the mill that was to be built and where it was to be located. But more interesting, he was shown how it was to be constructed. The total concept of the project was not explained to the stockholders all at once. So, section by section, the mill was drafted, and then work was commenced on it. Money was difficult to obtain, yet it seemed to come with a miraculous but continuous flow. As a new section or part of the construction was started, money came in to meet the needs for its completion. The mill, declared the bishop, would someday contain a new process that would revolutionize the milling and refining industry. He described how a man would someday come to the mine, just at the right time, with a discovery of a new process for milling ore that would be more efficient, yet much more simple, than any other previously known processing system. The Dream Mine would be the first to put this new discovery to use. The bishop said that with this new process even the dump pile would prove valuable enough to run through the mill. Stockholders rallied together with money and labor to build this new edifice at the mine. Alexander Pope, architect for the Hawaiian temple, was given the contract to make blueprints for the mill, but he soon learned, to his astonishment, that every major portion of the mill he designed was already under construction by the time he arrived with the blueprints. Samuel Taylor said he built the mill in typical Coyle fashion. When construction was underway and things were too far along to recall, the directors demanded an architect. The builder refused to do another tap without blueprints. "I didn't need no blueprints," Coyle says. "I knowed what I wanted." But he did compromise. He hired an architect. The builder, meanwhile, agreed to go on while awaiting finished specifications. By the time the first section was done, the architect came around with the blueprints for it, Coyle says, grinning. He, meanwhile, had started on the next section, and the architect hastened to catch up. How much influence the architect actually had might be impossible to say, but the finished mill is truly magnificent. It looks like no other flotation mill in the world. Gleaming white, with modernistic horizontal window lines, it appears to be an apartment house, a rich man's castle or a skyscraper built against the mountain. Coyle is justly proud of it. Time in the Dream Mine, Taylor Esquire, November 1943. Work continued and an electric power line was added which was connected to the Spanish Fork power plant. Also a roadway was built with a total length of over 4 miles carved out of the side of the mountain. This roadway was also connected up with Water Canyon. The mill was built near the mouth of the mine tunnel, which was ideally located for the ore that would be taken out of the mountain. Its construction was placed on the side of the mountain where it gently flowed with the contour of the mountain. Its symmetrical beauty and form were accented in white. No one looks upon it without acknowledging that it has an elegant style. It is a complimentary achievement to the industry and foresight of Bishop Coyle and the men who labored on it. It was built during the nation's worst epoch in its history. The estimated cost of the mill was $100,000, which is probably close to the actual value. However, the State Securities Commission estimated the cost of the mill at $20,000. But several factors had to be considered. First, that their estimation was reported in December of 1932, even before the mill had been completed. Also, that many workers took stock in payment for their labor on the mill, rather than a cash outlay from the treasury. Processing ore from the mine never reached a production basis, however, some ore was milled and sold. Several men on different occasions came to the mine with claims of a new discovery for processing ore. One significant part of the mill's history was the construction of an improved sluice machine or riffle jig by William Howard of Salt Lake City. His invention was this: ore was crushed to an 80 or 100 mesh size, and then placed in the jig, and treated with a watery solution. This would form a scum in which the metal concentrates would be separated from the rock. Howard was placed under a contract to install a crusher in 2 units of his sluice machine. He declared that his machine was capable of processing 50 tons of ore every 24 hours. Rumors coupled with hope and Howard's speculations soon took hold of many stockholders and created a milling fever. Declared assay estimates of over $1,200 per ton did much to encourage the fever. In announcing these estimates, however, the informants neglected to state that the per ton referred to was in the terms of concentrates and not raw ore. Howard stated that he did not know how many tons of ore it would take to make a ton of concentrates. An historical study of the Coyle Relief Mine, 1894 to 1962, Christensen, page 34. A model of Howard's reduction machine was placed in the Murphy Boiler and Iron Works in Salt Lake City, where many of the stockholders and investigators went to examine it. Soon estimates of the mine's potential values and expected production grew out of proportion. J.O. Christensen, in his report to the State Securities Commission, related the results of his investigation into these claims and rumors that were being circulated. He determined that many of these reports and stories were ridiculous and were possibly started by Howard or his associates in an effort to sell their machine. Before the year of 1933 ended, it was evident that Howard's invention was not the process which was to revolutionize the milling and smelting industry. High hopes were again raised in the hearts of the stockholders in 1937 when the Glissmeyer brothers introduced three strangers from Colorado who had what they claimed was a new and revolutionary process for extracting metals from ores by the use of chemicals. A special demonstration was arranged at the mine by the inventor, John Harper, and his two associates, Gus Engelhart and Jake Brackage, to prove their claims. Although the process demonstrated unusual merit, it is alleged that, in order to make a greater impression on company officials and the stockholders, a certain amount of selenium was planted in these chemicals while processing a half-ton of ore that was brought from the upper workings on the mountain. The chemicals used seemed to have the remarkable quality of dissolving just about everything except wood, rubber and silica, and then, after the load was precipitated, the solution actually could be reactivated and used over again simply by adding certain chemicals. Having thoroughly demonstrated this amazing process to the complete satisfaction and knowledge of the mine's chemist, the inventory convinced Bishop Coyle and the directors of the need to set up a large-scale process in the mill, which seemed to be designed perfectly for this process, and there the values in the present ore could be processed on a commercial scale. Using only makeshift equipment with the first half-ton of ore, they produced some 12 pounds of selenium and 32 pounds of iron hydroxide, while other values were left still unrecovered. The selenium and iron hydroxide were shipped to the Harrison Company of Chicago, and a check for $103.03 was promptly returned in payment for the two metals. It was the first actual money ever received for a shipment from the Dream Mine, and strangely enough, the check was dated September 7, 1937, on the 43rd anniversary of the day when the first claims were staked out on this mountain. In a small way it was a fulfillment of the prediction that the first small shipment would come from the upper workings on the mountain. The selenium may have been planted by designing men, but the iron hydroxide was genuine, since it may be seen in visible abundance in several diggings in Water Canyon. Further testing later on by Willard Fuller, the mine's own chemist, using this same process for testing, revealed values in gold, cobalt, nickel, tin, titanium, osmium, chromium, iridium, vanadium, uranium, barium, zinc, bismuth, manganese, aluminum and traces of still other metals, but of selenium, there was no trace at all. If it was planted, they picked the wrong metal to plant, for it did not show up again. But while the new process was being established, a wave of new hope and encouragement swept over the stockholders. A great mass meeting was called, which filled the Spanish Fork High School auditorium to overflowing. A 3-car Orem train out of Salt Lake City pulled up in front of the high school to unload these special passengers, while others came from far and near by automobile and on foot to hear the good news. Upon hearing the startling claims made by the inventor and the high praise given him and his process by various ones of importance in the Coyle Mining Company, the stockholders then scraped the bottom of their depression-worn pockets to raise the money needed to buy the equipment necessary for a large-scale installation of this revolutionary process that would fit so nicely into their beautiful mill, a mill that so far had been nothing more than an idol monument to their faith. Now here was the key that would supposedly unlock the values. A series of graduated crushers, a pulverizer, a line of wooden tanks with rubberized electric agitators, a special rubberized rotary filter, precipitation tanks, pumps, and other equipment went into the development of a large-scale process as the stockholders' hopes soared to new heights of great expectations. A large-scale process presented many engineering bugs that had to be solved, and the inventor promised to remain and solve them and reap his reward in stock and from production returns. But the progress was slow, very, very slow, And the ore was of such poor quality that, rather than remain and try to succeed in this manner, John Harper and his associates became disgruntled and decided to abandon this project and seek quicker results elsewhere. However, death took a hand as John Harper suddenly died from a heart ailment. All that remained in the mill now was the abandoned equipment and a few crocks of half-processed ore, mostly lime or calcium, and but little desire on the part of anyone to try to complete this process until there was some worthwhile ore to justify it. One thing that was accomplished was the attraction of a large new group of stockholders to the company. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, pages 72 to 74. An electric ore furnace was later added to the mill to further implement ore reductions. Also, another kind of flotation process was installed in the mill. The mill was finally completed about 1936, at least as far as it was supposed to be for the present time. The bishop explained that someday more sections would be added to the mill both from the southwest side and to the bottom of the canyon. The humble living conditions of John Coyle are difficult for the modern saint to comprehend. For many years he lived in a small rented adobe house without plumbing, which was located on the outskirts of Spanish Fork. From here each day he would make his trek by horseback up to the mountain and then return again at night. The stockholders decided to make a building project of their own. In the year 1939, the stockholders unitedly contributed their time and money to help build a home for Bishop Coyle. It was time that he should have a decent house to live in and one that he could call his own. With the labor of love, the house project developed quickly. A host of workmen framed the house in one day. It was built on the mountain, near the mill, where the bishop could be close to the mine and enjoy a beautiful view of the valley below. Since the home had a large full basement, it was a good place to hold stockholders' meetings. They had previously been held annually on Labor Day at the Grove, but now it was decided to have meetings once a week on each Thursday night. These were not religious nor any type of church meetings, but rather a legal and lawful stockholders' meeting. It was in these meetings that people came to hear the latest developments at the mine or perhaps to hear the story of how the mine first began. The meetings were usually started with prayer and song, as any worthy gathering should be conducted. Many of the stockholders expressed their reasons for purchasing stock, while others felt they had been converted to it by divine guidance. The meetings usually resembled a testimony meeting as many speakers appeared to be filled with the Spirit and power of God. The bishop was frequently the last to speak, and most of the time he expressed words that seemed to be flavored with the spirit of prophecy and revelation. Little wonder that so many stockholders would travel a great distance to attend those Thursday night meetings. Bishop Coyle saw that two banks would eventually be established, one in Spanish Fork and the other at the mine. As early as 1911, his prediction about the economic decline and collapse was recorded by Carter Grant. At that time he told about how he saw the Dream Mine establish a bank on a certain corner in Spanish Fork, and later he spoke of another one at the mine in White City. He saw groups of people coming to this bank with long sad faces, their pleas for help having gone unheeded by other banks. But they left with happy faces, because here they had found relief, and their homes and farms were saved from foreclosure. The other bank seemed to be useless, and, although filled with money, they would lend hardly any of it for fear that it could not be paid back. And when they did lend any of it, they were after high interest rates of around 8 and 10%. Unemployment was widespread, and many people were losing their farms and homes, because most of them would be heavily mortgaged at this time. The other banks, he said, would complain against our bank, demanding that we cease letting money out at 4% with little or no security. But since we had plenty of gold back of us, there was little or nothing they could do about it. He said that people would bless this company for what we were doing, because their burden of distress was so great that nowhere could they find relief except here. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 66. The first ore that would come from the mine would be sent somewhere to a smelter. But the second would be processed at home at the mine's own mill. The first major production of gold from the mine would be valuable enough to pay for all of the work that had ever been done on that mountain. In 1930, the bishop directed the workmen to level off 10 large terraces along the side of the hill near the mine. There, he said, would be the location of some of the huge storage bins that would be built to store grain for the famine of the future. He also told them that those terraces would remain free from any oak brush growing back on them, which always happened on other clearings they had made. For nearly 50 years this prediction has been verified by the flat barren spot which those men scraped off the mountainside. Carter Grant recorded some of his conversations with Bishop Coyle on these important matters. Wednesday, March 4, 1931. Last night brothers William A. Jones, Clyde Hood, Philip Tadge, Richard Sontag, and I went to Brother Coyle's, arriving at 8 p.m. After asking each one of us about the hard times, getting what we knew, Brother Coyle opened declaring that they would grow worse and worse each week, that even the church would become so hard-pressed that the cry of the needy could not be satisfied. March 14, 1931. Now as to storing wheat. Since this subject has been upon Brother Coyle's mind for some time, he stated to us that on Friday, March 13, while coming out the tunnel, inspiration came to him like a voice speaking, telling him to build double cement bins on the side hill near the powder magazine, one below the other, so that he could let the grain from the first bin run down into the next, and then down into the third and fourth. These long cement tanks or bins were to begin at the upper road and stretch down the hill, so that with the gates open between the bins, grain that was dropped into the top one would easily find its way down the incline to the lowest level. Then too, this plan, says Bishop Coyle, will put the grain upon our property, where no one can molest it, where we can make distribution as we see fit. All eyes are to look toward us for relief. Journal of Carter Grant. The angel who took John Coyle through the mine and the 9 large caverns led him through a large tunnel that came out into Water Canyon on the opposite side of the mountain. The angel told him that this tunnel had been built by the Nephites and was still there. From the mouth of the tunnel they built a roadway that led south across the valley bending down past Payson. From the air, or high on the mountain, this ancient roadway can easily be seen. It is built up on both sides, leveling across the top, and in places where it has been cut into, there can be seen large stones placed at the bottom and smaller stones at the top, as the roads of today are constructed. Men who have seen this tunnel at Water Canyon have described its walls being about 10 feet apart and about the same height. Across the mountain, on the other side of the canyon, can be seen many ancient hieroglyphics. Although in recent years people have caused much marring and defacing of these writings in stone, they have not been completely destroyed. See illustrations on page 140. Photo of ancient roadbed leaving Water Canyon. Ancient hieroglyphics in Water Canyon. The bishop was shown that about 175 feet below the capstone they would break into the vast body of ore that had previously been mined by the ancient Nephites. But, because of their wickedness, they were destroyed. The mute testimony of their artifacts and ornaments extol the rich empire they once developed. In one corner of the caverns there were vases standing 3 feet high, filled with gold coins of the money they used. Alma 11:4-19. When these are uncovered, there will be sufficient evidence to the Book of Mormon that will be irrefutable, even for the worst skeptic. Many ancient records shall also be uncovered and translated for the understanding of the saints. D&C 626. Such precious records will prove to be a much richer blessing to men than gold, for they will contain values of an eternal nature for their salvation. For nearly 2,000 years these huge rooms in this vastly rich ore body have been concealed. But they shall once again become a vast source of wealth and power for a people who shall prove themselves worthy of such a blessing. Most men are unaware of the temporal and eternal riches that the Lord has in store for them, and in their ignorance they are rejecting those things the Lord has revealed to them. When the Lord releases these riches, then the white sentinel will become like an ensign to the nations for a place of relief, safety, and peace. Chapter 11. The Modern Gladiators. When God contemplates some great work, He begins it by the hand of some poor, weak, human creature, to whom He afterwards gives aid, so that the enemies who seek to obstruct it are overcome. Martin Luther, The Table Talk of Martin Luther, Hazlitt, page 32. The enemies of Bishop Coyle were continually making significant victories in their fight against him. It was not the kind of victory usually associated with good sportsmanship or an honorable Christian, where the champion helps the loser back on his feet or to regain his normal stability. The battle against Bishop Coyle was similar to the gladiators in the Roman arenas. It was a struggle to the death. These modern gladiators would use every conceivable means to permanently silence Bishop Coyle and his mine, just as the Roman gladiators often did to the early Christians. Bishop John Coyle sat in the audience of the Nebo State Quarterly Conference on July 15, 1928, to hear one of the most offensive rebukes of his life. Apostle James E. Talmage began his tirade against Coyle by stating that he had personally made a visit to the Dream Mine in 1913 and found nothing to convince him that the mine was worth anything. He denounced stock selling schemes which claimed any supernatural powers in connection with it and used Coyle's mine as a prime example. He urged all members of the church to have nothing to do with Coyle or his mine. He continued, "I say to you that the misrepresentations which have been made in selling the stock of the Coyle mine are of the evil one. I come to you as a representative of the presidency and the quorum of the 12 to warn you against it. I warn the owners in the name of the Lord and as his apostle that it is barren and always will be. The church will not close this mine or any other mine or enterprise that is legal because the church will not interfere with private interests. But the church will take a decided stand against anybody who tries to induce others to buy stock on the representation that angels of God have revealed these things and that the proceeds are to be used for the building up of the church. Don't raise your hand to sustain the prophets of the Lord and authorities of the church unless you are willing to follow their counsel and advice. If ever there was a day when the church was led by the gift of revelation, it is this day. The authorities are not asking you to do anything that they are not doing themselves. They are leading and asking the membership to follow." Spanish Fork Press, page 1, July 19, 1928. 2 months earlier he had written the following article for the Church News. Dream Mines. Editor, Deseret News. Word having reached me to the effect that I have expressed favorable opinion regarding present and prospective value of a certain mining property situated near Salem, Utah County, and known variously as the Coyle Mine, Relief Mine, and Dream Mine, I deem it advisable to make the following statement. Several years ago, at the request of parties concerned, including some of the officials of the company operating the property, I made an examination of the ground and excavations thereon, and reported to the effect that I found the so-called mine wholly barren of ore, and that the geological conditions were such as to offer no indication or promise of ore of a commercial nature being discovered on the property. I have held the same opinion since the time of my examination, and hold it today. Furthermore, when I visited the property, I was told that the mining operations theretofore carried on, and then in progress, had been largely influenced and directed by alleged dreams and visions of supernatural character, received by certain of the company officials and other interested parties, by whom these statements were made known to me personally. I am now informed that claims of supernatural direction in operating this mine are still current, and that I am understood as having endorsed them. I absolutely disclaim having given the least credence to any such alleged manifestations, whether dream, vision or otherwise. To the contrary, immediately after making the examination and hearing the statements of persons claiming to have received supernatural aid in directing the work, and on many later occasions, I emphatically declared that I regarded the alleged manifestations as spurious, and that the setting forth of such claims, allegations, or intimations as inducements to prospective purchasers of stock was wholly unjustifiable and fundamentally wrong. I reaffirm this now. James E. Talmage, May 4, 1928. Church Offices, 47E. So. Temple. 1. L.C., Utah. Day. News, May 14, 1928, 1. 1 of Church News. Then again in 1932 the Deseret News carried another statement of warning to members of the church against buying stock in the Coyle Mine. It read, "Church reaffirms stand on Coyle Dream Mine." The attitude of church officials concerning certain features in the mining operations of the Coyle Mining Company at the Dream or Relief Mine, east of Salem, remains the same today as it was expressed in a statement issued in 1913. It was declared Monday at the church offices. The reaffirming of their position came in answer to persistent reports that have reached the Genera authorities that stories are being circulated alleging that the church has changed its position in regard to the Dream Mine. The erroneous reports are that Dr. James E. Talmage of the Council of the 12 is ready to apologize to the mine officials for his past statements concerning the mine, and that he will tell the officials of the mine to go ahead, and that the general authorities are opposing Elder Talmage in his stand on the Dream Mine, that they have called him to account for his statements made in public, that his church position is in jeopardy unless he apologizes to the mine officials, and that the Genera authorities are themselves ready to tell the mine officials to go ahead. Deseret News, September 19, 1932, page 1. Then in October of the same year, President Heber J. Grant spoke to the General Priesthood session of the semi-annual conference and said that John Coyle had been lying to the people for the last 20 years. The lies he referred to were probably the prophecies accredited to the bishop. However, a lie is falsehood, but Coyle's prophecies were continually being fulfilled and therefore proved themselves true. Carter Grant had jumped into the conflict by writing a letter to Apostle Talmage. Part of this appeal was as follows. If you should ask me for one suggestion, as the chairman of our group, I would say, call the promoter before the highest tribunal of this church, not leaving it to any ward or stake, for it is a whole church affair, stock being owned in many missions, in dozens of wards and a score of stakes. I am positive that should you listen to his story as a quorum, you would have definite information, real facts in the case. Then, when the members of the quorum speak, they can say, we have heard the matter. Here is what we have found. If you should ask Brother Coyle to appear and he refused, you have a straight case against him. If he comes, you have your first-hand information. Even what I give you is second-hand. Nobody can make a good case on such statements, especially when one letter and one afternoon would finish the whole matter. Really, I am in earnest. The present method takes your time, it takes mine, as well as the worry over the whole matter. Why prolong it? If you will call me over the phone, setting the date for such a hearing, I shall either see that he is there or notify you ahead so there will be no conflict. I shall come with him if desired. I can think of no meeting or decision before the church so vital right now as the passing of first-hand judgment in the matter. All our committee would welcome it. Then too, it would put a stop to the statements that the authorities of the church have never seen Brother Coyle and have nothing but hearsay. How can they pass intelligent judgment, etc.? Following the hearing, you would know exactly what steps to take. There would be no misunderstandings, no mistakes. That is how I feel about it. Grant Talmage Statement, September 9, 1931, page 8. However, the general authorities still refused an audience to Bishop Coyle. How strange that the bishop tried all his life to personally speak with the church authorities, but with every attempt they flatly refused. 1. Golden Kimball also entered the arena. When he was called into the office of the church president, he was censured for his support of the Dream Mine. Heber J. Grant pounded his desk and said, "There's no more gold in that mountain than there is on this desk." Golden answered by saying, "Well, there's as much gold in Coyle's mine as there was in that mine that you and the brethren promoted up in Oregon." The church leaders had been convinced of a potential ore deposit in a mountain in Oregon, which had every possible element for success, at least by the standards of geologist Dr. James E. Talmage. However, after much work and expense, nothing ever came of it. Golden made a perfect squelch, but it didn't stop their combat against Coyle. As opposition grew against Coyle's work, it seemed that the Lord only drew nearer to him. It was during the greatest contests with his opponents that his greatest prophecies were being made. This proved true in 1913, 1928, 1932, and finally in 1945. Whenever discouragement, indifference, or inactivity set in among the workers or stockholders, or when some church leaders made a significant blow against that work, then another shot in the arm or spiritual manifestation revived them. God supported the men connected with that special work in many ways. In 1918, when World War I was involving the nations of the earth, Bishop Coyle warned people of a greater war to come. Then in December 1941 the blow fell upon America for the fulfillment of the bishop's prophecy. But now that the war was on, everyone was concerned about when it would end. It was August of 1942 when Bishop Coyle was visiting his dentist friend, Dr. Alfred Brooksby, in Fredonia, Arizona. Brooksby was very concerned over the results of the war and when it would be over, because he had close relations who were enlisted in the military service. Dr. Brooksby told the author the story of how the bishop knew when the war would be over. He said the bishop was staying at his home, and one morning he came out of the bedroom and sat down to the breakfast table and then said, "Well, I know now when the war will be over. The Lord told me last night." The war had been taking a terrible toll for 6 months, but the bishop declared that it would continue for another 3 years from that very time. It seemed impossible that the war could last that much longer. How could American boys survive so much warfare? When Bishop Coyle returned to Utah that August, he stood before the stockholders at their usual Thursday night meeting and told them that the war would be over 3 years from that date. That kind of news spread everywhere. People were marking it down and telling it to everyone. Believers and non-believers in the mine were taking notice of such a significant prophecy. It was something that concerned everyone. Some of the bishop's antagonists in church leadership positions also took note. They wanted that prophecy to fail and thereby prove that Bishop Coyle was deceived and thus a false prophet. Although they could offer no prophecy either to substantiate or refute what the bishop had said, they still maintained that he was a false prophet. Time would tell. The stockholders now had another handle to grasp in their efforts to convince others of the inspiration coming to Bishop Coyle. Fred Vinch, a carpenter, was working at nearby Camp Kearns. Being very much devoted to the dream mine, he was also watching this prophecy carefully during the summer of 1945. A big boiler was being installed in one of the buildings at Camp Kearns, and he wrote on it with a piece of chalk, August 27, 1945. His co-workers asked him what it meant, and he said, "It means that the war will be over and won by that date." Now, of course, no one believed him nor the source of information that he gave. It all appeared so very ridiculous and impossible at that time that everyone laughed at him. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 50. Steve Wood, an insurance man and ardent stockholder in the mine, had his name and picture printed in the paper by his friend, Les Goetz, the Deseret News sports columnist. They discussed the war issue and made a dinner wager on the outcome of the war, based on the bishop's prediction. Other stockholders were having similar reactions and responses to their confidence in the latest dream mine prophecy. Everyone connected with the mine was talking about this end of the war prophecy. For 3 years, the excitement and expectation of the war's end was foremost on the minds of the stockholders. Finally, on August 6, 1945, when the conclusion of the war looked like it was still a long way off, the atomic bomb was dropped on the military base of Hiroshima. The next day, another atom bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The world was surprised and shocked at the fact that one bomb was doing what 2,000 B-29 Superfortress bombers were normally required to accomplish. By August 27, the Japanese were frantically trying to surrender. It was all over but for the formal signing of the peace terms. The fulfillment of another major prophecy by Bishop Coyle brought new enthusiasm and confidence to the mine stockholders. However, church leaders were dismayed. It was disturbing to them that this little farmer miner was able to make so many startling prophecies while they were experiencing a spiritual dearth in the prophesying realm. Bishop Coyle's successful prediction of the end of the war brought both favorable acclaim and disfavorable hostility. On December 29, 1945, the often published statement of 1913 was again released by the First Presidency of the Church, with the following introduction: "Continued reports reach us of the persistence of long-standing evils against which the members were warned many years ago by the First Presidency of the Church, then composed of President Joseph F. Smith with Anthony H. Lund and Charles W. Penrose as counselors. In order that there may be no justification for any misunderstanding by the members of the Church regarding these matters, nor regarding the attitude of the First Presidency thereon, we deem it wise to reprint, as we do below, the warning issued by these brethren under date of August 2, 1913. The statement was then reprinted with the signatures of George Albert Smith, J. Reuben Clark, and David O. McKay at the bottom. Again, on September 7, 1946, another barrage against the bishop appeared in the Deseret News. See following page. But to make things look worse for the church leaders, an interesting news release had been circulated by many of the dream miners. The church had gone into the mining business. But the irony of it was they were at the same time trying to close down another man's mine. The Deseret News. September 7, 1946. Editorial. Dream mines. Telephone inquiries are again coming in about the so-called Coyle Dream Mine and reported sale of stock in that property. It is said that some persons of local prominence are again agitating the sale of stock in that mine, and in some instances have claimed to have received revelations that certain of their neighbors should buy this stock. It is also claimed in some instances, as it has been claimed in the past, that the church authorities are no longer opposed to the so-called supernatural basis upon which the mine is being operated, and some go so far as to quote Dr. James E. Talmage as saying that he admitted being mistaken in his earlier studies of the mine. Latter-day Saints should understand that at no time have church officials changed their attitude regarding this mine and its supernatural claims. On December 29, 1945, there was republished in the church section of the Deseret News a statement of the First Presidency of the Church, warning members of the church away from schemes based on supernatural claims by which persons hope to get gain. Said the presidency, "We feel it our duty to warn the Latter-day Saints against mining schemes which have no warrant for success beyond the professed spiritual manifestations of their projectors and the influence gained over the excited minds of their victims. We caution the saints against investing money or property in shares of stock which bring no profit to anyone but those who issue and trade in them." Financial schemes to make money for the alleged purpose of redeeming Zion or providing means for the salvation of the dead or other seemingly worthy objects should not deceive anyone acquainted with the order of the church. This statement was first prepared in the days of President Joseph F. Smith, and on December 29, 1945, was reiterated by the present First Presidency, who said on that date, "We commend the foregoing to the careful consideration of all members of the church at this time, many of whom are the victims of alluring representations regarding mining and other investments. When salesmen for dream mine stock come and tell their neighbors they have been impressed by the Lord, that the neighbors should buy some of this stock, let those neighbors beware, and go and discuss the matter with their bishops and stake presidents. When claims are made that Dr. Talmage changed his mind about this mine, let all remember that such claims were made in the lifetime of Dr. Talmage, and in answer to them, he published in the Deseret News on May 14, 1928, a statement including the following: several years ago, at the request of parties concerned, including some of the officials of the company operating this Coyle property, I made an examination of the ground and excavations thereon, and reported to the effect that I found the so-called mine wholly barren of ore, and that the geological conditions were such as to offer no indication of the promise of ore discovery commercial value on that property. I have held the same opinion since the time of my examination, and hold it today." The following ironical sidelight developed, which may be found in a news article in the Salt Lake Tribune for September 6, 1940, on page 14, in the upper right corner. It tells of one Z.H. Workman, 57, of Syracuse, Utah, who fleeced some of the general authorities of the church and other prominent men of thousands of dollars when they invested money in a mine which they were never able to find. Among the complaining witnesses at a court hearing were Richard R. Lyman and Dr. Joseph F. Merrill, also Dr. Warren Shepard and C.O. Sanders. Dr. Shepard said he gave the defendant $500, Mr. Saunders said he gave $792, and Dr. Merrill $2,100. Mr. Lyman said he gave checks to a reputed associate of Mr. Workman, but he was not questioned as to the amounts. LT has alleged that there were several other church authorities taken in this manner who did not care to reveal themselves as complaining witnesses. The Deseret News gave an account of the event without giving the names of the victims. The point is that no one at all dared to question their right to invest their money in a mine which they were never able to find, yet it was deemed expedient for this quorum of investment experts to warn everybody against investing in a mine that did exist, their main objection being that the operators of the dream mine sought for, and claimed to receive, divine guidance in their business, and also their objection was that they exhorted their stockholders to use this wealth for righteous purposes connected with the future of this people. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, pages 83, 85. A few years later, church leaders were again involved in a mining venture. Salt Lake Telegram. August 13, 1952. Wednesday evening P22. Up and down the street. LDS Church organizes metal mining concern. By Robert W. Burnick. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is going into the non-ferrous metal mining business. The Utah Mine Company, capitalized at $10,000, has qualified to do business in the state of Utah. Its offices are at 47 E South Temple, the same location as those of the LDS Church. Apostles Henry D. Moyle and Legrand Richards are president and vice president respectively. Joseph L. Worthlan, presiding bishop of the LDS Church, is secretary. William H. Reeder of the church's property section said the corporation was organized to hold certain lead-silver zinc mining claims in Wauk County. Mr. Reeder said the claims were deeded to the church many years ago. All of the $1 par value common stock of the firm has been subscribed. Under its genera charter, the Utah Mine Company can engage in anything having to do with mining. It also is empowered to lease and to enter into agreements with other persons or companies. In 1944, Mark E. Peterson was made an apostle. When this news event was announced, Bishop Coyle said, "That man will become the worst enemy this work has ever had." One of the directors of the mine, by the name of Phil Tadge, said, "Oh no. He's a personal friend of mine. I know he will never cause us any trouble." But the bishop reaffirmed his appraisal. Phil's friends soon took up where the late Dr. Talmage left off. He spearheaded the opposition against the mine by writing numerous articles in the Deseret News and also gave verbal advice both in public and in private against the mine. He was destined to become the worst enemy the mine ever had, just as the bishop had declared he would. In 1947, the author was astounded at an article published in the church section of the Deseret News. It said that John Coyle was holding sacrament meetings at the mine. "I was working and living at the mine, but I never saw any sacrament or sacrament meeting up there." It was these warped reports that would eventually cause the church leaders to bring down the final curtain on Bishop Coyle. On January 7, 1947, Bishop Coyle was summoned to a church trial. He appeared before his stake president and the high council of his stake in a formal church court proceeding. According to the few accounts which are available, the proceedings in some respects compassed a scene of questionable justice. In a secular court, the accused normally has the advantage of a non-partisan judge and jury. As occasioned here, however, this was not the case. Practically everyone present was well versed in the history of the mine, in addition to being intimately acquainted with its aged prophet. Partisan feelings for and against the old man were such that emotions might well have replaced facts as a basis for judgment. Historical study of the Coyle Relief Mine, Christensen, page 54. The court proceedings had all been prearranged. An unmerciful decree had been written for this special occasion. The bishop was ordered to sign this typed statement or else lose his membership in the church. The bishop repeatedly bore testimony of the reality of the numerous spiritual experiences that he had and the complete fulfillment of the promises that had been made to him by the Lord. He desperately sought to stay the decision of the court by requesting a hearing with the president of the church, just as he had done in 1913. However, they said that such a procedure was not according to the rules of the court. Therefore, his request was denied. Like criminal lawyers who badger a client into a breakdown, Bishop Coyle was continually threatened with excommunication if he did not sign the paper. This was the same old procedure of the Catholics who, during the Dark Ages, forced signatures from the heretics who chose to disagree with the Pope. There seemed to be no way out for him. It was sign a lie or be classed as an excommunicated apostate. At this moment he was in a complete state of quandary. Under the pressure of such unwarranted bombardment, the poor man broke down and wept. The ultimatum was a most consequential form of mandate. Both choices were bitter to his soul. From nearly 7 o'clock that evening until midnight he was pressured to sign that document. Finally he spoke up and said, "You are forcing me to sign a lie." Raymond Taylor, one of the high councilmen, told him that, if he would sign it, then they could get the interview with the president of the church. He, John Coyle, was getting old now, in his 84th year. For a long time his health had been failing badly, and even now he had been on a sick bed for several days. The years had taken their toll of his strength and vigor, filled as they had been with so much trouble and persecution, and now most of the fight was gone out of him. He knew that his days on earth were about over, and for the few that might be left to him, he did so want to cling to his membership in the church for which he had been a missionary and a bishop, a membership which, so many LDS believed was essential to salvation. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 93. The bishop was told, and knew, that if he did not sign that document, he would be excommunicated, and then others who were associated with him would be excommunicated also. What he didn't know was that they would excommunicate him, and others like him anyway. One of his close associates begged him, saying, "For heaven's sake, Bishop, don't let them take away your membership." He was expressing fear for both himself and for other stockholders. None of them thought that they would be brought to this final test, the truth or their membership in the church. They didn't think the leaders of the church would go that far in this issue. Coyle looked at the paper and then made one more request. If he signed it, would they agree not to make it public until after he had a chance to present his case to the head of the church? The request was acceptable and agreed upon. Then John H. Coyle, sick and weakened, with the fight gone out of him, and his two closest friends urging him on, did that which his Nephite mentors, long ago in 1914, had warned him not ever to do. He signed this bold-faced lie and cleverly conceived repudiation to save his friends and himself from the church axe, which was hanging over them ready to drop if he did not sign. Herein was the full significance of the Nephite warning to him that he should never write anything, nor sign any written statement about the mine. To that warning he had always tried to be strictly obedient, not even so much as writing a personal letter to anybody, and what is more unfortunate, not putting his wonderful experiences in his own writing. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 94. After the document had been signed, and they went to the home of Quayle Dixon, the bishop was weeping and sobbing like a child. He bore the consequence of a concession just as the prophet Joseph did when he gave the Book of Mormon manuscript to Martin Harris. CD and C Section 10. It was merely an expression of human weakness, but it was a spiritual catastrophe. As Moses, who in a moment of weakness took honor from the Lord, lost his chance to visit the promised land, so by the stroke of a pen the bishop took honor away from the Lord for the mine. He would not live to see the promised ore. The statement was an explosive shockwave to the dream miners. However, everyone soon knew that he had signed it merely as a means to retain his membership in the church. The men responsible for Coyle's trial did not keep their promises. First, they published that document without his consent and against their own word that they would not do such a thing. Second, they excommunicated him after they promised him that they would not if he signed that statement. Third, they never made the promised arrangements for Coyle to have an interview with the church president. And fourth, they continued to harass, threaten and excommunicate stockholders of the mine. Quayle Dixon and Wallace Strong signed the declaration as witnesses. All three names appeared on the front page of the Deseret News in full-size reproduction of the declaration with their signatures as they were signed on that document. See following article. It was an agreement with hell and he suffered the pains of hell. He suffered more and grieved more because of his signature on that document than for any other sin of his life. Because the general authorities had consummated their cleverly conceived placard, the bishop realized that he had been exploited and betrayed. The full impact of what he had done by signing that directive was now clear to him. Under coercion and threats, he had put his trust in the arm of flesh, the general authorities, and now he suffered the curse. Remorse and regret are the consequences of sin, and now came the godly sorrow that only repentant sinners know. His grief newly brought him to death. In that state of agony to the soul, his departed wife came to him in a dream to impress him with the necessary will to continue with his life and mission. She concurred that the signing of that document was wrong, that it was a satanically inspired testament, but that they on the other side realized and understood the pressures that had been brought upon the bishop. Centuries of history have been filled with these evil and coercive pressures and the influences that work upon men to use them. The whole picture became clear to his mind, and he knew now why the messengers had warned him not to sign anything. The bishop repented as best as he knew how. He always referred to that incident as the worst thing I ever did in my life. But the signing of that publicized denunciation did not kill the mine, nor the faith of the stockholders. So another plan was devised by his enemies. John H. Coyle repudiates all claims regarding Dream Mine. To whom it may concern, I, John H. Coyle, do sustain the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as the prophet, seer, and revelator of the Lord in this day. I do believe that the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints alone has the right to receive divine guidance for the people of this church as a whole, and am willing to sustain the first presidency of this church as all things, including their stand and instruction with regard to the so-called Dream Mine, of which I am the principal leader. I hereby repudiate all statements which I have made against the advice of the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as pertaining to this Dream Mine and my conduct of it, and I hereby repudiate all spiritual claims I have made with respect to the mine. I appeal to all of my followers to join with me in this repudiation of claims to divine guidance in connection with this mine, and to regard this mine as a business venture without any religious significance. I also ask all stockholders in this mine to harmonize their thinking with the published statements of the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with respect to the Dream Mine, and to honor and sustain the First Presidency as the only ones chosen of the Lord to give divine direction on any subject pertaining to the church at large. I ask my followers likewise to retract all statements they have made to the effect that the authorities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have been mistaken with regard to our mine. I appeal to all stockholders in this mine to rally around the authorities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and give to them their undivided loyalty, which I now hereby do. I voluntarily do this of my own free will and choice. John H. Coyle, Sig. Witnesses, Quayle Dixon, Sig. Wallace Strong, Sig. State of Utah. SS. County of Utah. Personally appeared before me, a notary public, this 7th day of January, 1947, Quayle Dixon and Wallace Strong, the signers of this instrument, as witnesses, and John E. Coyle, the principal signer of the above. B. L. Isaac, Sig. Notary Public, residing at Spanish Fork, Utah. Commission expires April 7, 1947. Photographic proof above is a photographic reproduction of the statement in which John H. Coyle, For more than 50 years, the leading figure in the so-called Dream Mine near Spanish Fork, Utah, repudiated all divine claims with respect to that mine. The document was executed last night following a formal High Council trial held at Spanish Fork and covering the claims Coyle has made in the past with respect to the mine. Stockholders asked to take similar stand. Spanish Fork John H. Coyle, head of the so-called Dream Mine, or Relief Mine, which is located in the mountains east of here, last night completely repudiated all claims to divine guidance with regard to the mine. He accepted fully and completely the stand of the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints regarding the mine, and retracted any and all statements he had made in which he said that the First Presidency were mistaken concerning this mine. He also called upon all of his followers and stockholders to make similar repudiation and retraction, and asked them to regard this mine as a business venture without any religious significance. Accept statement. He accepted the published statement of the First Presidency concerning the Dream Mine and asked his followers to harmonize their thinking with the published statements of the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with respect to the Dream Mine, and to honor and sustain the First Presidency as the only ones chosen of the Lord to give divine direction on any subject pertaining to the Church at large. His statement was signed following a formal High Council trial held here last night, presided over by President William J. O'Brien of the Palmyra Stake and his two counselors, J. Angus Christensen and Wallace H. Gardner. The statement was signed in the presence of the Stake High Council and was signed by two of Mr. Coyle's followers as legal witnesses. They are Quayle Dixon and Wallace Strung. The document was then notarized by B. L. Isaac, Notary Public. Refers to document. The statement of the First Presidency, referred to in the document executed by Mr. Coyle, was published in the December 29, 1945 issue of the Church section of the Deseret News, and reads as follows: To officers and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, from the day of Hiram page, Doctrine and Covenant section 28, at different periods there have been manifestations from delusive spirits to members of the Church. Sometimes these have come to men and women who, because of transgression, become east prey to the arch-deceiver. At other times these people who pride themselves on their strict observance of the rules and ordinances and ceremonies of the Church are led astray by false spirits who exercise an influence so imitative of that which proceeds from a divine source that even these persons who think they are the very elect find it difficult to discern the essential difference. Satan himself has transformed himself to be apparently an angel of light. When visions, dreams, tongues, prophecy, impressions, or an extraordinary gift of inspiration conveys something out of harmony with the accepted revelations of the Church, or contrary to the decisions of the constituted authorities, Latter-day Saints may know that it is not of God, no matter how plausible it may appear. Also, Apostle Mark E. Peterson came to Spanish Fork as an advisor to the local authorities for the express purpose of excommunicating Bishop Coyle. A formal trial was set for April 1, 1948, a little more than a year since the church trial, where he was forced to sign the repudiation. The bishop obediently came to the trial, only to find that it was merely a pre-arranged formality. The decision and judgment had already been made. It was not much more than an announcement, swift and to the point, with no defense allowed, and then the job was done. John H. Coyle was excommunicated from the church. When he called out, "Where are my accusers?" no one stepped forth. But ere his judges left the room, they heard him state that they all must answer for this, and that Mark Peterson, whose orders he said they were obeying, would go down, and down, and down and out. Although Mark Peterson was not in the room at the time, he knew that he was in an adjacent room listening carefully to everything, and that he heard the statement, a statement not made in the heated wrath of the moment, for he had made it once before when Mark E. Peterson was made an apostle. Now it was a matter of record again. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 95. Both church records and personal interviews with Mark Peterson indicate that the action taken against Coyle was not from the local level, but rather it came in a directive from the First Presidency wherein the leaders of the Palmyra Stake were counseled to deprive Coyle of his membership. Accordingly, Apostle Mark E. Peterson was sent to Spanish Fork as an advisor to the local authorities. Historical Study of the Coyle Relief Mine, 1894-1962, Christensen, page 55. Deseret News. The Family Newspaper. Salt Lake City, Utah, Friday evening, April 16, 1948. Coyle excommunicated. John H. Coyle, of Spanish Fork, Utah, was excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints last night in a charge of insubordination to the rules and authority of the Church. Action was taken by the Presidency and High Council of the Palmeiras Stake in a meeting held at the stake offices in Spanish Fork. The Lord had a watchful eye upon Bishop Coyle, and this was known by a few of the authorities in the Church. Years after his visitations from angels and his dream concerning the mine, he was called by revelation, through the Church authorities, to receive the Church's highest blessings. He was a man who was important enough to the powers on high, that about the time he made a bishop, about 1910, he was visited by his stake president, who declared that he had been commanded by an angel of the Lord to recommend Bishop Coyle for his second anointings. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 97. John was ordained a bishop in the church on May 31, 1908. For 8 years prior to this, he had served as counselor to his bishop when the Leland Ward was organized in 1900. Soon after John Coyle was made bishop, he was called by revelation to go before the prophet and receive his second anointing, which is a blessing few men get. This put him beyond the authority of earthly men, subject only to the powers and dictates of the Lord. Relief Mine Story, J. Young, page 2. But his excommunication accomplished one thing: it completed the division between the two sides on that issue. It was a responsibility as extreme as either side could assume. LT brought into judgment the fact that either Coyle was being deceived or else the modern leaders were. There was no longer any middle ground. Many other church members have received the same rendition of justice. It seems that whenever someone raises questions or casts doubts upon recent doctrinal manipulations in the church, the leaders choose to ignore the question or else silence the inquirer. When questions are asked that may prove embarrassing to answer, the response may be excommunication. The person or persons can then be classed as apostate. But not every man who is excommunicated is an apostate to the Lord. Persons sometimes say that they have enjoyed the spirit of the work as much since they were cut off as while they were in the church. Have they enjoyed the spirit? Yes. Why? Simply because they were wrongfully cut off. They were cut off in such a way that it did not take the Spirit of God from them. And the reason why they were cut off was because they did not come up to the particular standard of perfection of those who dealt with them, or they did not come up to their feelings. Mill. Star 2499, 1862. But in many of these modern cases of excommunication, a much more important factor is involved. Not only is the victim being judged, but also the principles that he advocates. Men should be excommunicated for sin. Personal beliefs or feelings are not grounds for excommunication. At the trial of Bishop Coyle, the first presidency of the church were actually judging the revelations that had been received by Bishop Coyle. But if Coyle had been misled by the devil, then he should have been brought to trial in 1894. Action should have been taken before so much work had been completed at the mine, and before so many thousands and thousands of church people became involved. Why was he brought to trial 54 years later? Was it because many men in high church positions had gradually changed until the revelations of the Lord became offensive and intolerable to them? Many revelations given to the early church leaders are now rejected by the modern church leaders. But it was apparent as early as 1392 that something was wrong when the church was so financially depressed, and yet a revelation showing how to locate the needed wealth did not come to the leaders of the church. Their predicament was relieved by a revelation of God to a humble young man named Jesse Knight. This same financial confrontation will again be realized when the financial structure of the nation will collapse and the church shall again be brought to its knees. Here then is the ultimate test for both lay member and leader in the church, that they must learn the truth for themselves by the power of the Holy Ghost. They can't trust in something else or someone else, for a curse is promised to all who put their trust in the arm of flesh. If the blind led the blind, or if the blind followed the blind, they both shall fall into that proverbial and spiritual ditch. Therefore, man should not counsel his fellow man, nor trust in the arm of flesh, but rather let God dictate to him, so that he might speak in the name of God. Bishop Coyle was one of those few men who could talk to God, but like the prophets of old, he had to pay the price to do it. Chapter 12. Death of a man and a mine. But, behold, the righteous, the saints of the Holy One of Israel, they who have believed in the Holy One of Israel, they who have endured the crosses of the world, and despised the shame of it, they shall inherit the kingdom of God, which was prepared for them from the foundation of the world. And their joy shall be full forever. 2 Nevi 9:18. John Coyle was a simple man. His desires in life were few and so were his possessions. He was mild-mannered and soft-spoken, and when he was asked a question, he often hesitated for a few moments before giving an answer. He was always willing to listen, as well as to talk, and yet he would never force his opinions on others. He was a rather short man, stoop-shouldered from a lifetime of work and a vast array of burdens. His country-style speech was homey, with a sort of wry wit which always put a distinct twinkle in his eyes. His kind manners and cordial friendship quickly won the love of all who knew him. John was usually dressed in a faded work shirt and dungarees supported by wide suspenders. He was born and reared from that common folk stock which made him an ideal friend and a good neighbor. When John reached his 80th birthday, a special tribute was prepared for him by some of the mine stockholders. A small pamphlet was printed for the occasion which is reprinted here. We salute you, John Hiram Coyle, on the occasion of your 80th birthday. Monday, August 14, 1944. John Hiram Coyle. John H. Coyle was born on August 14, 1864, in Spanish Fork, Utah. His father died when he was but 9 years of age. He was reared in all the hardships of early pioneer life. One of the hard trials which he was called on to face was a move to the Muddy River in the Mopa Valley some 400 miles to the southwest, over a most difficult road. Here he nearly lost his life from the bite of a rattlesnake. He again had a narrow escape when his father lost his life in a rock slide. He filled a most remarkable mission in the southern states under Presidents W.M. Spry, who later became governor of the state of Utah, and J. Golden Kimball. The latter became his lifelong friend. We had some wonderful dreams in which he was shown a gold mine whose treasures were to relieve an entire community in time of great distress. This seemed so stupendous to him that he went to his stake president for counsel, who told him it was of God. Yet, not satisfied, he counseled with Apostle George Teasdale, with whom he was personally acquainted. The apostle sanctioned what his stake president had said and said, "God bless you, go ahead." During the succeeding many years he devoted himself untiringly to this work which was outlined to him. During all this time he accomplished many wonderful things, among which are a tunnel and drifts in solid rock totaling 5,000 feet. Shafts and inclines also in rock amounting to 2,500 feet. A dug way up the mountain likewise carved out of rock which is 3 miles long and graded so that an automobile can go up and down. All of this work was done the hard way, by hand. During the depths of the Depression, in 1932, he built a concrete flotation mill which is fully equipped, and its present value would be over $100,000 after having talked for many years about storing food for a famine. In 1932 he surveyed, leveled, graded and terraced a place on the hillside for the building of large grain bins which are to hold 1,000,000 bushels of grain. More than 500 acres of land, not counting the mining claims, have been purchased, costing $30,000. All of these items are paid for in full. They include 2 streams of water which are invaluable. He has been assisted by 5,000 stockholders who have stood solidly behind him. After his splendid mission in early life he was made superintendent of the Sunday school in Leland Ward. During this time he served as counselor to the bishop. Later on he was ordained bishop of that same ward. He was loved and honored by all the members. At the meeting when he was released from his calling as bishop, the ward members voted 100% to retain him. Again in Idaho he was chosen as counselor to the bishop. Later in life he was made class leader of the high priests in his ward and the head block teacher. This was the ward where his stake president lived. All through his life he has been a devoted Latter-day Saint, acquainting himself with the scriptures and thus becoming very qualified to expound them. He has a perfect tithe-paying record. He has a numerous posterity, all of the members of the church, and not one he uses tobacco or liquor. And now, Bishop Coyle, your stockholders salute you on this your 80th birthday, and we pray that you shall live many happy years to enjoy the fruits of your labor and complete the tasks that you have so nobly carried these many years. A tribute to John Hiram Coyle on his 80th birthday, August 14, 1944. The roof was made of willows, the floor was made of earth. Where 80 years ago today, this great man had his birth. Throughout the days of childhood, evil forces lurked nearby in an effort to destroy him, but a power from on high kept him safe, his footsteps guided, while he grew from child to man, as his life was very precious to the great eternal plan. For his daily bread he struggled, and his earthly goods were few, but his faith and honest effort proved his heart was staunch and true. 30 years had passed away when one night he had a dream, and a messenger imparted unto him a task supreme. while he took him through a mountain, which was precious, sacred ground. And he showed him all the places where rich treasures did abound. Then he gave him much instruction, where to work, and how to mine, and convinced this man we honor that his mission was divine. 20 years he worked and labored, then, one January night, from deep sleep he was awakened, in his room there came a light. And 2 messengers stood by him, while the taller of the 2 spoke to him in careful detail of the work he was to do. For 2 long hours he listened, sitting upright in his bed. He was told about the dreams he dreamed, how he was being led by higher powers than his own, on each step of the way. They told him they would guard this hill until that glorious day when these rich treasures should come forth, according to the plan, to bring relief, and untold worth, and benefit to man. Now 50 years have passed away. The road's been rough and long, the persecutions many, yet still he presses on, though church, and state and nation have assailed him left and right, and evil forces threatened to destroy put out his light. He has never lost his courage, he's been honest, loyal and true, for he knows with all his heart and soul that God will see him through. Virginia Lindsay Thomender. The tribute was well deserved, although it was one of the few honors he would ever receive in his lifetime. In less than 4 years from its publication, he would be dead. The story of his life is a complex one, mostly because of his conflict with those who were determined to be his enemies. The very persons whom he made his greatest efforts to befriend were those who dealt him most of his troubles. Many stockholders seemed confused over the division between believers and non-believers among church leaders. How, they asked, is it possible that a split in believers could cause a rift all the way up through the first presidency of the church? Some leaders said the mine was of the evil one, while others prayed and received answers and testimonies that it was of God. But there were many reasons for such a division. When the church is in harmony with the laws of heaven, then it is the proper order of things to have God speak to and through the head of the church. However, if church leadership seeks to back away or excuses themselves from obedience to any of the laws of God, then they are out of order, and God will go elsewhere to find people who will listen and obey him. The prophet Joseph Smith confirmed this by saying, If Zion will not purify herself so as to be approved of in all things in his sight, he will seek another people, for his work will go on until Israel is gathered, and they who will not hear his voice must expect to feel his wrath. TPJS, page 18. By the turn of the century, it became evident that all things were not approved of in his sight. Church leaders began to discourage the gathering of Israel and belief in and practice of other important doctrines. It was very apparent that Bishop Coyle would never get to have a hearing with the first presidency of the church because they continued to grow more and more hostile towards the mine with each successive church administration. Likewise, these men would never have a chance to hear the message the Nephite messengers told the bishop during the hour and a half. Now it would be the duty of the third Nephite to deal directly with the church leadership when the time was right. They would eventually be released from their offices to their shame for the manner in which they had treated the revelations of God. Nevertheless, he was given to understand by the powers guiding the mine that these men would, in the due time of the Lord, be removed from their high offices, and others would replace them who would cooperate hand in complete harmony with the operators of the mine, so that this great work of the Lord might see a full and complete fruition of all its destined purposes, and the mission of this sanctified project would not fail, but all the sacred and special causes would be served for which these choice records and treasures had been reserved throughout so many generations of time by a wisdom above that of man's. Bishop Coyle was shown that when vindication came, a complete setting in order in the church would be at hand. This, he said, was shown to him by the prophet Joseph Smith himself, who clearly demonstrated to him that not one single general authority of the old order would be left, but that all would be removed, and that new ones called of God would replace them. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 86. When the church and its members were sorely pressed for money during the Depression of the 1890s, the Lord spoke to Jesse Knight rather than to the president of the church, and relief came to the church and its members through Jesse Knight's mine. When the church and its members are brought into the great financial collapse of this nation, they will also know that the Lord spoke to John H. Coyle when relief comes to the church and its members from his mine. When the prophet Joseph Smith came to Bishop Coyle, he said, "Come, Bishop, I want to show you something that I am going to do." Joseph went to the leaders of the church and began to release them one by one and replace them with some others. Finally the bishop said, "Brother Joseph, are you going to let them all go?" The prophet turned to him and sternly replied, "Every jack last one of them, they had their chance and they failed." This setting in order would include many people in many positions, because the bishop said it would be first the church, then the state, and then the nation. All of these would be brought up standing to judgment like a wild colt is brought to a snubbing post. The scriptures abound with references to the Lord setting his house in order. It shall be one of the most important events of the last days. To believe in this event, it requires much faith and an understanding of the scriptures. Men must prepare themselves mentally and spiritually for those crowning events, for God shall again speak from the heavens to reveal his will, and to direct the affairs of men on earth in great power. In May 1949 the bishop became sick, and although he was extremely ill, he fought for life. But he knew that he was not going to live much longer. He had received a dream indicating that his life's mission would soon come to a close. As his last days approached, he would have Dean Dallin take him down to the Second Ward Chapel, where he had last been a member. He could not see what was going on because his eyes were dimmed from sickness, cataracts, and age, so he would ask Dean if the chapel was being torn down yet. When on one of these trips, Dean assured him that the chapel was now being torn down, and the ward members were using the high school auditorium for a chapel until a new one could be built. Bishop Coyle then felt that he was ready to die. In a few days, he took sick again and was taken to the hospital for the last time. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 98. Drilling out the main shaft, tunneling for the 5 fingers, construction of the mill, and all the other work had finally been completed just as the bishop saw it in 1894. All that remained was the firing of those few rounds of explosive charges that would bring in the ore. But this was yet in the future. The bishop's mission in mortality, however, was finished. The mine would now fall into that void of dark clouds as he saw in a dream, which would completely cover the sky and the mine. Bishop Coyle had become bent from the burden of many difficult years of work and toil. Now the old warrior lay sick on death's door, and life was ebbing away. He would soon find the peace and rest that only the righteous will ever know. As he lay quietly on his deathbed, suddenly his eyes widened, and he looked upwards. With an expression of rapture, he cried, "Joseph, Joseph, Joseph." Then the last light and life of Bishop Coyle was gone. Here was a man who knew and talked with Joseph Smith, the prophet. The bishop had taught and honored the gospel as it was revealed to the prophet Joseph. Now as he passed into the world of spirits, he, like Brigham Young, uttered those same words at meeting again their beloved leader and friend. John H. Coyle dies at age 84. An official notice of the bishop's death appeared in the Deseret News. It was not an ordinary obituary, for it was placed on the front page of the second section of the paper. It read, "Spanish Fork, John Hiram Coyle, 84, president and promoter of the so-called Dream Mine in the mountains east of Spanish Fork, died Tuesday, May 17, 1949, at 9 a.m. in a Payson hospital." He had been in the hospital since last Wednesday, when he suffered a heart attack. Mr. Coyle was founder and president of the Coyle Mining Company, which promoted and operated the widely known Dream Mine. While the company was organized more than 50 years ago, the mine has always been on a prospect basis. In promoting the mine, Mr. Coyle claimed divine guidance. He repudiated all such claims in a public statement January 7, 1947. He was excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, April 16, 1948, after conviction in a church court on a charge of insubordination. He had been conducting meetings contrary to the order of the church. Mr. Coyle was born August 14, 1864, at Spanish Fork, a son of John Hiram and Anita Hillman Coyle. He received his education in the Spanish Fork schools and spent a few years in Idaho ranching. He was married to Emily Arvilla Holt, December 9, 1884. She preceded him in death. He had one time served as bishop of the Leland Ward in Spanish Fork. Surviving are 7 sons and daughters: John Leroy Coyle and Merrill Scoville Coyle, Spanish Fork; Ross Fielding Coyle, Mrs. Zara Evelyn Stout, Mrs. Alinda Duke, and Mrs. Emma Winward, all of Burley, Idaho; Mrs. Lucille Waite, Pocatello; and about 15 grandchildren and several great-grandchildren. Deseret News, May 19, 1949. Funeral services were held in the local school auditorium at Spanish Fork. Mourners filled the building to an overflowing crowd who came to pay their last respects to this prophet of God, perhaps the last of his kind in this generation. The local church authorities had no jurisdiction over the high school, so they were powerless to deny them the use of their chapel, and from among his friends there was plenty of priesthood authority to give the service all the sacred touch it needed. The Dream Mind Story, Pierce, page 99. It is true that the priesthood was always well represented both in his life and at his death. Those few men in this dispensation who could speak to God and receive an answer were the men who acknowledged Bishop Coyle as an inspired servant of God. Besides such men as President Anthony W. Ivins, Apostle George Teasdale, Apostle Matthias F. Cowley, President J. Golden Kimball, and other stake and ward authorities in the church, there were men such as Joseph Musser who told the author that the Lord has shown Bishop Coyle his work, and he has shown me mine. Lauren Woolley also never spoke against the bishop, even saying that riches would come from that mine and others for the benefit of the saints. Burial was in the Spanish Fork Cemetery. Joseph E. Geertsen, that man who stood so close to the bishop in his last days, dedicated the grave. LT was a dedication, a prayer and a prophecy, for he said, by the authority of the priesthood, we dedicate this ground, and this casket, and the clothing, the robes and garments, and the body, that is resting here, that no evil power may harm or disturb, or mar this resting place, until, Father, thou shalt call forth his body, to unite with his spirit, to accomplish his mission yet upon this earth. Pierce, page 102. The day after Bishop Coyle died, Quayle Dixon, secretary of the mine, ordered a shutdown of all operations on the hill. Phil Tage became president of the mining company for about 6 months, at which time he was replaced by Quayle Dixon, who retained a leadership position until just before his death December 4, 1988. He was often questioned by church authorities and threatened with excommunication, but it was never carried out. Many people ask the question of why the mine has not yet produced any ore. This same question was asked Bishop Coyle by Austin Fife, who wrote, "If you ventured the question which you thought would be the most embarrassing to him, how do you explain the fact that although you have dug for 40 years, the mine has not yet produced a single ounce of pay dirt?" You were surprised by an answer that betrayed neither embarrassment nor lack of hope. The mine is to produce only when the financial structure of the world is about to collapse. It will begin to produce just in time to save the saints from the economic ruin that will wreck the world. Saints of Sage and Saddle, 5, pages 283-84. Christ never saw the triumph of his church while he lived. The prophet Joseph Smith never saw the redemption of Zion while he was alive. And Bishop Coyle never realized the materialization of the ore deposited in that mountain. But in the last days they all shall see the fulfillment of their vision. Brigham Young saw in vision and subsequently directed the labors for the construction of the Salt Lake Temple. Though he never lived to see the completion of that magnificent work, it took workmen over 40 years of drilling, carving and hulling rock. Yet he had hopes of seeing that temple built in a manner that it will endure through the millennium. J.D. 10-254. Bishop Coyle saw in vision and then directed the labors of the mine, and he too never lived to see the completion of that project. Workmen have labored on the mine for over 84 years, drilling, carving, and hulling rock. Both the temple and the mine were divinely inspired, both were dedicated to the salvation of men, one for the spiritual, the other for the temporal. Both were labors to last into the millennium. Before John Coyle ever struck a pick into that mountain, he was told that the mine would come in when the world was in a chaotic state, when famine, war and pestilence were about to pose a threat to all mankind. Why then do people judge the lack of ore in prosperous times as a way to determine that it is a fraud? Everything about the mine has taken place just as the bishop prophesied that it would. Even this long shutdown was one of the major prophecies that had to come to pass. The enemies of that work are gloating over the bishop's death just as they did when Joseph Smith was killed and when they crucified the Son of God. They assumed that it would be the end of those spiritualists, rabble-rousers and fanatics. But their work is still proceeding, slowly but effectively. It is a time of trial, it is a time when God is employing the most severe form of test to his people. Only a few are becoming diamonds in the rough, those precious stones that look like the rest of the gravel, but who, in the day of the Lord's return, shall become those polished gems of which he said he'd make up his jewels with a polish and beauty that would endure forever. How significant and symbolic is the story of Joseph in Egypt in comparison to John H. Coyle. Joseph was denounced as a dreamer and was cast off by his brothers. But it was through the gift of dreams that Joseph brought honor and salvation to the house of Israel. Through his gift of dreams, God was able to provide food for a 7-year famine. Even his brothers, who had rejected him and his gift of dreams, came in repentance to acknowledge that God had indeed spoken to him. Also, the great patriarch over the Israelites, Jacob, came to pay honor and to be saved from the famine. It was through Joseph that the house of Israel was brought together, and Joseph gave them food and prosperity. Through his gift of dreams, they were saved from disaster. Because of the gift of dreams, John Coyle was cast out by his brethren. But in the day of distress and famine, his brethren will repentantly acknowledge that God had indeed spoken to him. The children of Israel will again be gathered together, and they will be fed, while famine and pestilence ravage the world. In that day, John H. Coyle shall receive the honor that was denied him in mortality. When Bishop Coyle died and the mine was closed, only a caretaker, an occasional visitor, or a few stockholders doing assessment work were seen on the mountain. This was the beginning of the dark clouds that would overshadow the mine. The workmen had left, and most work had stopped. No more Thursday night meetings would be held. Bishop Coyle was dead, and the mine was dying. But some work had to continue, as an annual assessment of $8,000 worth of work was required to continue the leases in the property. Much was done on the outside of the mine, but some felt that another attempt should be made to reactivate work in the mine. A letter was written to the stockholders by Lyman S. Wood for a meeting to be held on May 8, 1950, in Spanish Fork. It was an attempt to resume work in the mine with men and materials. This meeting never accomplished much because of the lack of interest and failure of sufficient numbers to be represented. On May 27, 1950, a letter was written to the board of directors from the advisory board with a 4-point recommendation. 1. The mine should be removed from a closed-down condition, and money and men should proceed with the objective of reaching the ore. 2. Elections for the board of directors should be held on June 17. Members of the board must be sustained by common consent of popular vote. 3. All stockholders should be notified of the forthcoming election, and work should proceed, even if a quorum majority is not present. 4. A reply from each of the directors to the chairman of the advisory board, Joseph E. Geertsen, was also requested. The next 5 years were very difficult ones, with leading stockholders being divided on what should be done at the mine. It was very difficult to come up with even the money for taxes. A flurry of short-lived activity came in 1955, when Quayle Dixon, who was elevated to the board of directors in 1950, began receiving several letters from an Al Sinclair in Texas. Sinclair requested a sample of ore for the mine. Later he bought several tons at $100 a ton, which he processed into a compound for acidless automobile batteries. The next year Sinclair visited the mine and exhibited an interest in it and its potential. During the winter of 1956, work was started again and the rails, pumps, and ladders were repaired or replaced, which led down into the winds. 100 feet of water was pumped out and excitement was mounting, only to fall with the pump, which broke and allowed all the water to again fill the winds. According to Bishop Coyle, there would be an earthquake which would drain the winds when the time should come for it to be worked. The discouraged miners probably took the incident as a warning, so they proceeded back to the 200-foot level and sought for ore. None of the ore realized any values in their enthusiasm, and their finances were nearly exhausted. Work was temporarily halted until the spring of 1958, when Al Sinclair made a new announcement. He convinced the mine leaders that they had misunderstood Coyle, that it was necessary to first realize commercial value from the vast quantities of ore already taken from and stored in the mine. He proposed the idea of manufacturing a soil conditioner from the ore. By now many of the directors and stockholders were convinced that Al was one of the three Nephites. Although some of the stockholders had seen Sinclair smoking, an old Lamanite habit, and reports came back that he was teaching a Protestant Sunday school class in Texas, these things did not seem to dampen their faith in him as a Nephite. Others, however, claimed that after Bishop Coyle passed away, spirituality at the mine also died. Tons of ore came from the mine and were used as a soil conditioner or fertilizer on gardens and lawns. This was not what the mine was intended for, but some of the stockholders were enthusiastic. Another idea was advanced for use of the ore. If a nuclear bomb was dropped, this conditioner would ward the radioactive fallout. By 1960, plans were being made to market the material under the name of Comico, an abbreviation of Coyle Mining Company. Their hopes and expectations were to distribute their new product worldwide. Needless to say, Comico never met the international market, and operations at the mine soon returned to the usual assessment work. March 21, 1961, was the anniversary of the incorporated Coyle Mining Company. If a majority of stock could be represented, then an amendment to the articles of the mine could have extended the incorporation and also continue the name of the company. However, That was not accomplished. Therefore, the directors allowed the old company to become defunct. They decided to organize a new corporation called the Relief Mine Company. On April 12, 1961, the Articles of Incorporation were filed with the Utah County Clerk and Secretary of State. The Coyle Mining Company was now dead. The Coyle Mining Company was the name that appeared on all stock certificates, but because of the constant reference to the manner in which the mine was begun, it was soon called the Dream Mine. While the bishop was alive, and while the company existed under a 50-year incorporation, the mine continued on a prospect basis. After the reincorporation, the name was changed to Relief Mine. It is still called Dream Mine by most stockholders since it is still in its preparatory stages. However, when the great strike of riches is made, it shall fulfill its mission for the relief of the poor. Then the title of Relief Mine will become significantly appropriate. Capital stock in the new company was increased to 1 million shares as compared to the 700,000 shares in the Coyle Mining Company. It was to become a perpetual existence form of corporation, rather than a 50-year corporation. The old stock could be surrendered to the secretary of the Relief Mine Company for cancellation, and may receive in exchange a like number of shares in the latter corporation. However, these transactions had to be made within a 7-year period from the date of the announcement. Since a stockholder was required to have 1,000 shares of stock to qualify as a director, Al Sinclair was given the necessary stock to qualify for the position and was then added to the board of directors. The others were Quayle Dixon, Douglas Dixon, his brother, Homer Harwood, Horace Brough, and Laver Hulley was the secretary. The bishop often told the story of the dream about a little patch of blue sky which was a prophecy concerning the last days of the mine. I heard the bishop relate this dream while I was visiting with him one night. One of the board of directors came to his house to see him that evening, and the bishop seemed very intent in relating this dream to this director. Dark clouds began to gather until they had completely covered the sky. The whole heavens appeared to be black with very little light around. Everything was engulfed in darkness. Then I looked northwest toward the point of the mountain, and I saw a small patch of blue in the sky. Then it began to grow. Suddenly it pushed all the darkness away, and then the whole sky was blue and sunny again. This was the bishop's dream of the long shutdown at the mine. Then in a priesthood session of the 140th Annual Conference on April 4, 1970, President Harold B. Lee read the statement of 1913 to reaffirm the church's position. It was a sort of coup de grace for the mine. So, today is a dark day for the mine, but a prosperous one for the church and the rest of the world. All eating nations are reveling in prosperity, but they are increasing in wickedness. Crime, corruption and conspiracy are bringing the nations of the earth to destruction. Men are bought and sold in high places, gold and governments are being traded or confiscated through the powers of deception and darkness. So subtle and successful are the influences of these secret combinations that the devil has gained nearly total control of the world. These things are happening according to the prophecies of Bishop Coyle, but soon the greatest of his prophecies will be fulfilled. Chapter 13. Prophecies and their fulfillment. Prophecy is not intended to open the future to idle curiosity, but for the higher purpose of furnishing light to those whose faith needs confirming. The revelation of future events may be needful in times of discouragement, to awaken or sustain hope, to inspire confidence in the midst of general backsliding, and to warn of evil threatening the faithful. Unger's Bible Dictionary, page 892. Prophets and prophecies are mentioned hundreds of times in the scriptures, and for a good reason. They are the seers of the future to warn, admonish and help mankind prepare for future events. Unfortunately, however, such spiritual beacons often go unheeded. A prophet is usually defined as a man of God, or as a mouthpiece for God. Thus, he is considered as a person delivering a message from the true God of heaven. Amos said, "The Lord God has spoken. Who can but prophesy?" Amos 3:8. Here, then, is a distinction among many men who claim to be prophets, seers, and revelators, but they never receive the words of prophecy and revelation. There may be 1,000 claim to be prophets, but only one may have the true gift of prophecy. How strange that in the 55 years that Bishop Coyle operated the mine, he was continually making prophecies and seeing them fulfilled, but it seemed that no one else could make the same claim. The prophecies of Bishop Coyle were not given for entertainment nor curiosity. They were meant to convey a message of warning and instruction. If this generation fails to benefit from them, they justly deserve the consequences. The purpose of this chapter is to quickly review some of John Coyle's prophecies so that the readers can be more aware of their message and learn from them. The author worked with the bishop at the mine for about 2 years and has personally seen the fulfillment of many of his prophecies, and he talked with others who saw the fulfillment of nearly all the rest. The following prophecies, though not necessarily the greatest, deserve mention and serious consideration. 1. Mobs in the mission field. John Coyle was shown in dreams that mobs would harass the missionaries. Twice they came just as he was shown, but he avoided conflict because he had been shown what to do. One of these prophecies concerned J. Golden Kimball, the mission president. 2. Operating the mine. Bishop Coyle was shown how to operate the mine, where to start, and what they would find along the way. The workers in the mine reported finding the very formations, colors, and conditions that had been foretold, and at the time they were to discover them. 3. Men and money at the mine. The bishop was promised that he need not worry about help at the mine, nor money to operate it. Both men and money would always be forthcoming as the need arose. For 35 years, from 1914 to 1949, regardless of wars, depressions, inflations, opposition, and persecution, the mine had manpower when needed and always was able to meet operating expenses. 4. Cars like boxcars. When the automobile was in its beginning stages, Coyle said they would become as big as railroad boxcars and would have something like eyes on them. Today we see thousands of huge cargo trucks on the highways with headlights that look like eyes. 5. The water ditch. The bishop instructed workers to build a small ditch that would be big enough to carry the water they would find. The miners dug the ditch, and at the exact distance described by John Coyle, they hit the water that just filled the ditch. 6. The Mexican temple. When the church announced that its next temple would be built in Mexico, the bishop said it would not. A year later the saints were driven out of Mexico, and the next temple was not built in that country. 7. World War I. Bishop Coyle described a great world war in which the United States would become involved. 10 years later World War I began. Coyle said that the 145th Artillery, most of which were Mormon boys, would not see action. Even though the 145th was sent to the front line, they did not engage in battle. 8. Depression of 1929. The bishop told his banker in Spanish Fork that in 4 months there would be a terrible depression. 4 months later, October 29, the Great Depression began. 9. Shutdown and reopening. The two Nephites told John Coyle that the mine would, for necessity, be shut down, but that the powers that shut it down would be the same powers to reopen it. 6 months later the bishop was told by the general authorities of the church that if he continued working and selling stock at the mine, he would be excommunicated. The bishop obeyed their injunction and closed down all operations at the mine. After 6 years President Heber J. Grant sent a letter to the bishop requesting that he open the mine to pay off a large bill at ZCMI. 10. Joseph Fielding Smith sermon. Bishop Coyle told J. Golden Kimball to go to J.F. Smith and ask him not to deliver his conference speech against the mine. Unwillingly, J. Golden went to President Smith with the request and was surprised to learn that Joseph Fielding had not told anyone about that sermon. And so he never gave it. This was one of J. Golden's favorite dream mine stories. 11. End of World War II. Shortly after Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, Bishop Coyle said it would be exactly 3 years later before the war would end. 3 years later, in August 1945, the Japanese gave notice of their surrender. 12. The powder mill. The bishop foretold of a huge manufacturing plant that would be built near the entrance to the Springville Canyon. Many years later when the war began, a huge powder plant was built on this spot and remains there today. 13. Mark E. Peterson. When young Mark E. Peterson was made a member of the Quorum of 12, the bishop said he would be the worst enemy the mine ever had. Mark Peterson soon began a constant tirade, with both verbal and written statements against the mine. He also wrote up a denial of the spiritual nature of the mine and forced Bishop Coyle to sign it. He then instigated a trial to have John excommunicated from the church. 14. 3 men would die. The bishop said that 3 men would die at the Dream Mine. After nearly 100 years of operation, exactly 3 men had been accidentally killed there. 15. Muddy water. John Coyle said muddy water would someday flow through the streets of Utah from one end of the state to the other. In 1983 heavy snow melt and rains caused water damages throughout Utah, in over 29 counties, from one end of the state to the other. 16. Kennecott, Geneva, Tintic standstill. The bishop said before the mine would come in that Kennecott copper and Geneva steel would shut down, and the Tintic mining area would come almost to a standstill. In 1985, records show that all three occurred at the same time. 17. Wall Street boost. Bishop Coyle said that Wall Street would have a major drop sometime before the total failure, and at that time the government would step in to help save it. In October 1988, Black Monday, the stock market came to within 2 hours of total catastrophe, and the government stepped in to prevent it. 18. The beacon light. The bishop described a beacon light that would someday be placed at the top of the Dream Mine Mountain. Years after his death, the telephone company placed a transmitter and a huge beacon light on the top of the mountain that can be seen today. The greatest prophecy that Bishop John Coyle ever made concerned the coming in of the mine and the White City that would be associated with it. The dream mine was to produce a vast fortune in gold at the time that this country is being devastated by a financial depression, famine and war. There are hundreds of prophecies dating back to the days of Joseph Smith about the collapse of this nation. The important difference is that the bishop's prophecy is the only one that has shown how the Mormon people would be able to survive these terrible judgments. If there is no hope of relief from Bishop Coyle's mine, then we have little hope left. From the heads of our government down to the back alley criminals, this nation has filled its cup with iniquity. It cannot survive much longer with such corruption and crime. As has been foretold, this nation must serve God, the true and only God, or they should be swept off. Either 2:8. Chapter 14. The modern gold rush. Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. James 5:3. The course pursued by men of business in the world has a tendency to make a few rich and to sink the masses of the people into poverty and degradation. Brigham Young, J.D. 11-348. America has a broad and rich history of visionary men who struggled to forge a nation out of wilderness. Through their sweat and blood, and out of the humblest of circumstances, they have ingeniously developed the world's greatest enterprising system of government and industry. In 200 years, these wise and inspired men have established a prosperous and free country to which every other nation has looked with envy. However, in the last half-century, America has been the victim of an astronomical debt that exceeds all the combined debts of all the nations of the earth. Her treasury and vast gold supplies have dwindled until they have been lost or mortgaged to other nations. Both the citizens and their nation are in excessive bondage. What has happened? America has been the victim of an international conspiracy. Ever since gold has been used as a standard for money, men have deviously acquired means for stealing it from each other. This plundering still continues, from a few ounces of gold dust to the grand theft of billions of dollars from the treasury vaults of nations. Greater sums of gold and more subtle techniques for stealing it are being accomplished today than ever before. Hoarding gold is the prime object of international thieves because gold is both wealth and power. With gold, men can start wars, create financial depressions and make slaves out of millions of people. For this reason, the nature and value of gold should be understood by every man who loves his freedom, property, and independence. The fate of a man or the destiny of a nation may depend on the understanding and attitude that men have towards gold. Gold, being the only universally accepted money, by its very nature, carries a tremendous amount of power. Those who control it are in the position to coerce those who don't. As long as the control of gold is in the hands of the people, we are safe. But when the control of gold falls into the hands of tyrants, we are in trouble. For this reason, dictators, as soon as they take over a country, confiscate all of the gold and silver. Not only do they need these precious metals to finance their wars, but they must also strip the people of their natural wealth. The easiest way to control people is through their pocketbook. Gold, the natural enemy of socialism, N. Leppert, page 2. Men and governments possessing gold are financially sound. They are capable of purchasing their needs, aiding others who are in bondage, or they can protect themselves from natural or mortal enemies. However, paper money, or promissory notes, have been a bad substitute for money. The use of paper money is only a financial shortcut for the convenience of exchange. Thus, men have learned to exchange receipts instead of trading gold. These receipts, called paper currency or notes, only indicate that there is gold or silver in the bank or national treasury that can be exchanged for that note. The paper is a title to a portion of money on reserve. A promissory note is not money, but an order to deliver money. Paper currency is used for convenience, but it has been the victim of much abuse. Bankers and goldsmiths soon began to make loans on gold which belonged to someone else. Later they began to make loans, at a high interest, on gold which was not even in their vaults. Government treasuries also have propounded this fraud. Howard Kirshner has written a brief historical outline of the ruinous effect that paper currency has had upon nations. Thousands of years ago, a great civilization flowered for many centuries on the banks of the Nile. When the popularity-seeking pharaohs became extravagant and spent more than their income, debts accumulated and prices rose. To increase the quantity of money and make possible more spending, they debased the coinage, that is, decreased its intrinsic value, while its nominal value remained the same. The gold and silver coins of ancient Egypt were called in, melted, and recoined with a large proportion of some baser metal. The government then tried to maintain that the part-lead coins were worth as much as the all-gold coins. That was a lie, and everybody knew it. The good money was driven out, and Egyptian civilization declined, never to recover its grandeur. The same thing happened in Crete, where a brilliant civilization flourished for many centuries until the rulers became extravagant, accumulated debts, and sought to meet them by debasing the currency. Inflation appeared, people lost confidence in the monetary unit, stopped working and saving diligently, and Cretan civilization disappeared. The gold and silver that fled from Egypt and from Crete found a resting place in Greece, where it contributed much to the great culture that flourished there for many centuries. As long as people were frugal and public finance remained sound, these developments continued. But ambitious rulers began to spend more than they received. Once more, in accordance with Gresham's law, the gold and silver fled in the presence of debased money, and Grecian civilization declined, never to recover its ascendancy. Rome was the next home of thrift, economy, hard work, and sound money. Upon this solid foundation was constructed the great empire that ruled the known world. Again culture flourished. But the Caesars in their turn sought popularity by pensioning their friends and political favorites. Public money was siphoned off to help this or that group. Free bread, circuses, and extravagant spending sprees created mountain debts and rising prices. The tyrants of ancient Rome, however, were not dismayed. They said, "We know what happened in the other countries, and we're not going to let it happen here. We're going to fix prices so they can't rise." But fixing prices to avoid further rises always results in greater scarcity. If the price of wheat, for instance, is fixed too low to be profitable to farmers, they will grow less wheat and more rye, potatoes, or corn. These in turn must be controlled. There is no place to stop the process short of the fixing of all prices. They made the most savage attempt to control wages and prices ever made outside of modern Russia. But government-managed economy always results in lower production, and eventually the people were starving. God, Gold, and Government, Howard E. Kirshner, pages 63 to 65. At the end of the 18th century, France was trying to recover from the economic chaos brought about by printing press money. The money managers promised to bring prosperity again, but this time the money would be backed by government-owned land. Statesmen who objected to the idea were ridiculed, and some were forced to leave France. The news media then denounced gold as necessary to back the money because the government money was always superior to gold-backed money. The politicians declared that their printing press money would make them rich overnight, and they could buy all the luxuries they wanted, all backed by the government, of course. When the first fiat money was printed, a slight burst of prosperity glimmered on their economic stage. Then, like a wolf tasting blood for the first time, the people and the politicians clamored for more. Presses rolled again, and prices began to rise. Thus, when prices started to rise, the cost of living also rose, which in turn created another shortage of money. Thus the presses rolled on again, and so did their inflation. Within 5 years, a bushel of flour increased from 40 cents to $45, and sugar went from 18 cents to $12.50 a pound. Then the government stepped in to set up price controls. They established a legal profit for manufacturers and farmers. This set off a wave of black marketing. Thus the manufacturers and farmers who couldn't make ends meet went out of business, which created another financial crash with unemployment everywhere. The entire economy of France collapsed, but there were a few very wealthy people who benefited from it. However, the middle and working class people lost everything they had. When the Marxist-communist conspiracy finally seized Russia, they first sought to destroy the wealth of the people by printing as many paper rubles as they could. This would enslave the people by making them dependent on their dictatorship. This constant influx of paper money on the market soon caused the cheapest items to be sold for millions. This was all according to the policy of Lenin, who said that the best way to destroy a country is to debauch its currency. This was accomplished in Russia by printing paper money. After World War I, Germany had a ruinous war debt imposed upon them by John Foster Dulles, even though Woodrow Wilson had promised to reject it. The Weimar Republic began printing fiat paper money to increase their economy. Inflation set in and their paper money became weaker and weaker in purchasing power. Soon the workers literally ran to the factory gates with their pay so that their wives could rush it on to the markets before the prices would change again. Our founding fathers, who had experienced a money that was not worth a continental, forbid the printing of such money in this country. In Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution, they delegated to Congress the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin. To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. Also, in Article 1 and Article 10 they wrote, no state shall coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts. They did not want paper racketeers stealing our gold. But today America is suffering from an unsound fiat paper money system, huge taxation, and an astounding financial debt. Corruption and subversion have become so deep-rooted within our government that the president, his advisors, members of Congress and the Justice Department have all become victims of the same influences that have destroyed so many governments of the past. Even many huge industries have become corrupted and have sold themselves to this vain mess of pottage. Big banking and oil cartels have been seduced by Mother Babylon. These strange secret combinations have always shown up in the past, and it is no wonder that they would find a place in the last days as well. One man, an insider, wrote a 1,300-page book called Tragedy and Hope on the history and objectives of this present global conquest. His name is Dr. Carroll Quigley, a former professor of Harvard University. However, Dr. Quigley both supports and approves of this combination, as though it presents hope for the world, but tragedy for those who oppose it. He explained how this secret combination has had the power to manipulate, corrupt, coerce, and control millions of people and many governments and industries. He writes, in time they brought into their financial network the provincial banking centers, organized as commercial banks and savings banks, as well as insurance companies, to form all of these into a single financial system on an international scale which manipulated the quantity and flow of money, so that they were able to influence, if not control, governments on one side and industries on the other. The men who did this aspired to establish dynasties of international bankers and were at least as successful at this as were many of the dynastic political rulers. Tragedy and Hope, page 7. 1. Klein-Skousen also observed that these banking dynasties had learned that all governments must have sources of revenue from which to borrow in times of emergency. They had also learned that, by providing such funds from their own private resources, they could make both kings and democratic leaders tremendously subservient to their will. It had proven to be a most effective means of controlling political appointments and deciding political issues. The Naked Capitalist, page 7. In Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, our forefathers wrote, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin tender in payment of debts. They were well informed on the necessity of sound money. Therefore, they took this particular written means so that Congress would keep the responsibility of a sound money system. President Andrew Jackson overthrew the Second Bank of the United States when he exposed the majority of the stock being held by foreign interests. Such banking, he said in his veto message of July 10, 1832, was unauthorized by the Constitution, subversive of the rights of the states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. The economic grasp for financial control of this country was gradually built up through two pinnacles of economic and financial powers, of which one, centered in New York, was headed by J.P. Morgan and Company, and the other, in Ohio, was headed by the Rockefeller family. When these two cooperated, as they generally did, they could influence the economic life of the country to a large degree and could almost control its political life, at least on the federal level. Tragedy and Hope, Quigley, pages 71 to 72. American history has a long tradition of war against central banking ever since Thomas Jefferson's fight against Alexander Hamilton's scheme for the first Bank of the United States. In 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act and thus became a central banking system operated by many foreign elements unfriendly to the best interests of this nation. The reserve system was composed of 12 national banks, but only one does the controlling, which is in New York. The president appoints the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board for a 14-year term, but in spite of all this political structure, they act independent of any political decisions. In fact, the president is advised who should be appointed to the board. But what is worse is the fact that the Federal Reserve Board has successfully been able to avoid every attempt to conduct an audit of its books ever since its birth in 1913. The creation of the Federal Reserve System meant that the legislative department of government would lose its sovereignty and that the system of checks and balances of power set up by Thomas Jefferson in the Constitution would be destroyed. Congressman Louis McFadden, who was chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, commented, "The Depression was not accidental. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as the rulers of us all." Bankruptcy, page 4. And Gary Allen adds, by 1932 the Great Inflation of the 20s had been turned into the Great Depression of the 30s, and with the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, the banking insiders moved to consolidate their control of our money by arranging to call in gold lest it be used to hedge against any future massive expansion of the money supply by the Federal Reserve. This resulted in the Presidential Executive Order of April 5, 1933, requiring all Americans to take their gold bullion, gold coins, and gold-backed currency to their banks and exchange them for currency that was not redeemable in the precious metal. The banks, in turn, were required to deliver the gold and gold coins to the Federal Reserve Bank. The way was now clear for a decade-long inflationary looting of the economy to pay for a gradual centralization of power through which the United States could be most easily controlled by the powerful. Men behind the scenes, powerful men who realized that dictatorship is the ultimate monopoly. Bankruptcy, page 4. Under this new system of money management, the United States has been the victim of greater inflations, depressions, world wars, and no-win wars to create more debt to the international banking system. In 1915, Louis T. McFadden was elected to Congress from Pennsylvania, and he attempted to expose the Federal Reserve banking system. He accused the officials of the Federal Reserve of deliberately creating the Great Depression by their manipulation of credit and money. He is quoted as saying, "These 12 private credit monopolies were deceitfully and disloyally foisted upon this country by the bankers who came here from Europe and repaid us our hospitality by undermining our American institutions. They financed Trotsky's passage from New York to Russia so that he might assist in the destruction of the Russian Empire. They fomented and instigated the Russian Revolution and placed a large fund of American dollars at Trotsky's disposal in one of their branch banks in Sweden." Louis T. McFadden. Representative Patman tried to persuade the Federal Reserve officials to allow the government to audit their books, which the officials vigorously opposed. Chairman Patman said, "I think you've gone too far on this, insisting too much, even objecting to the GAO auditing your books. I think that is going rather far. For 50 years you had no audit by a government auditor. You have had no independent audit. You have handled hundreds of billions of dollars of government money, and yet you have had no audit of any kind by government auditors." Representative Patman in the Federal Reserve System after 50 years, page 897. Representative McFadden instigated impeachment proceedings against Federal Reserve officials and certain members of the Treasury Department. He accused them of stripping the U.S. Treasury of billions of dollars. He also charged them with unlawfully exporting gold reserves which belonged to the general public to foreign countries. In his conclusion of the impeachment charges, he said, "Whereas I charge them, jointly and severally, with the crime of having treasonably conspired and acted against the peace and security of the United States, and with having treasonably conspired to destroy constitutional government in the United States." Louis T. McFadden. After this there were 2 attacks on his life. Then he suddenly suffered heart failure after an attack of intestinal flu on October 3, 1936, and so did his House Resolution No. 158. 4 things happened with this federal machine. 1. It was owned by private individuals who controlled the nation's issuance of money. 2. It could have at its command the entire financial resources of the country. 3. It could mobilize wars through politicians so that the United States would plunge further into mortgages, inflation and debt. 4. The Board of Governors would be appointed by the executive branch, which removed the controls out of the hands of Congress. The further we became engulfed in debt, the more currency inflation was created by the Federal Reserve, thus more interest is obligated to the Federal Reserve Bank, who demands gold. At present, the national debt of the United States is more than the combined debt of all the other nations of the world, and the interest is the third largest expense on the federal budget. These internationalists demand gold for payment of the national interest debt. The gold movement within the U.S. is a cloak and dagger operation. Gold is actually moved a few hundred feet from one set of cages in the U.S. Assay Office to another set of cages in the Federal Reserve Bank by expensive armored trucks, merely to be rechecked and restored. The Gold Swindle, George Racy Jordan, page 10. America is secretly and cleverly being robbed of all its gold reserves. Nearly all of our gold has ended up in the Federal Reserve Banks, not in Fort Knox. No other form of revenue has been so profitable for the internationalists as the graduated income tax. With this money they have created unlawful bureaucracies in this country and given foreign aid to build up treacherous powers abroad. Our American forefathers wanted a home government, one which they could keep their eyes on and their hands on, if it tried to get out of their control. For that reason they compassed a union of separate states or governments. The Constitution kept the federal government small, but efficient. However, the 16th Amendment changed all that. It enabled the federal government to put its hands into the pockets of its citizens and also take their allegiance away from local governments. Their money was now taken to the central government rather than to local authorities over whom they had control. The economic power secured by the 16th Amendment enabled the federal government to bribe state governments, as well as citizens, into submission. Income taxation has weakened the entire spirit and purpose of the Constitution. The enormous revenues pouring into the federal government create agencies, bureaus, and powers which only destroy individuals' rights. The Income Tax Amendment is contrary to the spirit and the principles of the Constitution, of which it is a part. For the amendment gives to the federal government first claim upon the earnings of the individual, and so infringes his natural right to own what he produces. With its graduated tax provision, the Income Tax Amendment is a replica of that clause in the Communist Manifesto which provides for the confiscation of all property through the use of just such a tax. Not only is the individual citizen's liberty partitioned by the amendment, but the several states are deprived of their constitutional sovereignty, and the central federal government is overstrengthened at their expense. This growth of centralized power is a development which generations of Americans fought stubbornly to prevent. Flyleaf to the income tax root of all evil, Frank Chodorov. Karl Marx was the first advocate of a progressive income and inheritance taxation. He proposed this program as a means of destroying private property. It was published in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Every socialist party and every liberal communist sympathizer since then has advocated this platform. Hence, socialists and communists oppose the constitutional axiom of an individual's inalienable right to property. The principal cause of the revolution was taxation. It was declared that taxation without representation is tyranny, and it was an invasion upon their property rights. A people who were willing to go to war for a mere tea tax would certainly not tolerate having their pockets picked by an income tax. The Founding Fathers agreed with John Locke that government is an instrument for safeguarding private property, not an agency to take it away. Taxing the income has always been opposed by most American citizens and their representatives. Slavery and involuntary servitude means, essentially, forcing someone, against his will, to work or serve. Thus, when an employer is forced to serve as tax collector and bookkeeper for the government, without payment for his time and expense, and under threat of severe penalty for any error in a complicated set of rules and regulations, then he is certainly forced to involuntary servitude. And that by federal administration. The withholding law also violates that portion of the Fifth Amendment which says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The final evaluation of the federal tax system is the fruits of its operation. It had been described as an appalling mess of complicated inequities. It stifles initiative, wastes human energy and resources, distorts the national economy, and has a corrupting effect on both taxpayers and tax collectors. Controlling the finances of a government can be a very profitable business, especially when the bankers control the economy of the country. At every inflation and every recession, the bankers take in profits. All of this was centered upon the theme of which Quigley says was nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. Tragedy and Hope, page 324. There has always been a small hardcore group of men who have tried to conquer the world and its people. They do not believe in God, nor in the principles of truth and righteousness, but rather in themselves and in their combinations. Their only concern is to gain the economic and political power of the world. In doing so, they seek to win the natural resources and the manpower of the entire earth under a totalitarian, godless dictatorship. We are now witnessing the worst secret combination ever perpetuated on earth. Gold has always been a great power for both good and evil, depending on its use. More often, unfortunately, it has been the means of cankering the souls of men and corrupting governments and nations. Seldom has gold been used as God intended. But in the winding up scene, man will no more hoard, covet, or steal it, because God, through his strange act, will see that gold is used for his own purposes. Chapter 15. Conclusion. That I may proceed to bring to pass my act, my strange act, and perform my work, my strange work, that men may discern between the righteous and the wicked, saith your God. D&C 101-95. Fool's gold. The Lord has a controversy with the nations of the earth. Their corruptions and wickedness have given strength to the powers of darkness and driven away the Spirit of God. Through money-mad and power-hungry men, the greatest conspiracy ever created is now dominating the political and economic affairs of the world. Throughout the blood-soaked pages of history, these diabolical schemers have created wars, depressions, and slavery for others. The forces of evil always attempt to overthrow freedom, administer unjust laws, and rob others of their money and property. The only form of government known by wicked men is a totalitarian government, and tyranny is a doctrine of devils. Men cannot claim ignorance of the perils that are upon us, for John, the beloved apostle of Christ, left a solemn prophecy and warning to the saints of the latter days. John clearly saw a worldwide conspiracy that would nearly enslave the whole world prior to the millennial reign of Christ. He saw tyrannical powers, so powerful and domineering, that many men would be killed rather than become slaves to it. Rev. 13:15, John said it would attempt to force all men, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to become subservient to its power. This world conspiracy would shackle all men with an economic chain so tight that no man might buy or sell, 13:17, unless he subscribed to their monetary monopoly. Another clear description and warning concerning these evil conspiracies was given in the Book of Mormon. Moroni gave a warning to this generation when he said that such evil conspiracies have been handed down even from Cain, and that these secret and dark conspiracies are kept up by the power of the devil, and also they are had among all people to get power and gain. His final plea and warning was, "Wherefore, the Lord commandeth you, when ye shall see these things come among you, that ye shall awake to a sense of your awful situation, because of this secret combination which shall be among you, or woe be unto it, because of the blood of them who have been slain. For they cry from the dust for vengeance upon it, and also upon those who built it up. For it cometh to pass that whoso buildeth it up seeketh to overthrow the freedom of all lands, nations, and countries, and it bringeth to pass the destruction of all people, for it is built up by the devil, who is the father of all lies, even that same liar who beguiled our first parents, yea, even that same liar who hath caused man to commit murder from the beginning, who hath hardened the hearts of men that they have murdered the prophets, and stoned them, and cast them out from the beginning." Either 8:24-25. Since the day that Cain created a secret society, there has been a foundation upon which the devil could manipulate wicked men into doing his evil designs. When Jesus said, "My house is the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves," he was exposing the secret conspiracy of Satan. By casting out the den of thieves, he made war on the society of Satan, and he was signing his own death warrant. It was these servants of Satan who provided the 30 pieces of silver for Judas to betray Christ into their hands. This same secret combination arranged to have the Romans put him on trial, and also for the Romans to execute him. After the resurrection of Christ, these same masters of deceit met in secret council, and they gave large money unto the soldiers to lie about the resurrection of Christ's body. They further promised that, if it should come to the governor's ears, we will persuade him and secure you. Matt. 28:12-13. These money masters could buy soldiers, priests, or governors. They were able to persuade men to lie, cheat, steal, or betray. They use the same tactics today. All of the true apostles and disciples of Christ are aware of the conspiracies of Satan. Paul the apostle left a solemn warning to "Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." F. 6:12. As early as 1831, the Lord revealed to Joseph Smith that the enemy is combined, and these conspirators were plotting in secret chambers to bring to pass even your destruction in process of time, and ye knew it not. D&C 38:12-13. God commanded the missionaries, who were going to minister in the East, to warn those who believed in the gospel, to flee to the West, and this in consequence of that which is coming on the earth, and of secret combinations. D&C 42:64. Hence, the nucleus or central headquarters of the secret combinations was in the East. Later the Lord said, Watch, for the adversary spreadeth his dominions and darkness reigneth. D&C 82:5. In July 1849, 2 years after the saints arrived in the valley, a correspondent from the New York Tribune attended a meeting in Salt Lake City. On October 9, 1849, an article was published in that newspaper wherein Brigham Young was quoted as saying, After this came a lengthy discourse from Mr. Brigham Young, president of the society, partaking somewhat of politics, much of religion and philosophy, and a little on the subject of gold, showing the wealth, strength and glory of England, growing out of her coal mines, iron and industry, and the weakness, corruption, and degradation of Spanish America, Spain, etc., and her idle habits. Every one seemed interested and pleased with his remarks, and all appeared to be contented to stay at home and pursue a persevering industry, although mountains of gold were near them. The able speaker painted in lively colors the ruin which would be brought upon the United States by gold, and boldly predicted that they would be overthrown, because they had killed the prophets, stoned and rejected those who were sent to call them to repentance, and finally plundered and driven the church of the saints from their midst, and burned and desolated their city and temples. He said God had a reckoning with that people and gold would be the instrument of their overthrow. The Constitution and laws were good, in fact the best in the world, but the administrators were corrupt, and the laws and Constitution were not carried out, therefore they must fall. Day. News 2/1697. The devil is ruling the world today. With subtle deception he has blinded the eyes of those who should have detected and exposed him. It is one of the mysteries of the age, how American citizens have been so passive as they pay tribute to this massive destructive machine which is preparing their own burial. Ecclesiastical leaders, especially Mormons, seem to bend over backwards to pay homage to the modern disciples of the devil. When religious leaders revere such a pack of rascals, it is evident that the blind are leading the blind. The devil's deceptions have dirtied every table, and religious leaders cast aside the laws of God in their support of unconstitutional and unjust laws of the land. Our religious hierarchy are excommunicating members of the church for not paying the income tax in an effort to redouble their esteem for these modern Gladiator robbers. God once promised the children of Israel that if they would only serve him, then he would be their ruler and lawgiver. Not only did he promise to lead them to happiness, freedom, and wealth, but he also promised to fight their battles for them. Deut. 1:30, 3:22, 24. Thus, when Israel trusted God, they were prosperous and free, but as soon as they chose to have a mortal king, Sam 8:4-7, they became a captive nation, and were brought into bondage, slavery, and scattered among the nations. In the latter days, Israel has been commanded to gather together, and to obey only the law of the land which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges, which belongs to all mankind. D&C 98:5, they must live by every word which proceedeth forth out of the mouth of God. D&C 98:11 and Matt. 4:4. Men should serve God without fear of any man, neither fear that great beast which has been created, for God has promised to also fight the battles of Israel in the latter days. See D&C 98:115, 98:37, 105:14, 1 Nephi 22:14, 2 Nephi 27:3. Also Revelation of 1880. Well-informed Latter-day Saints know the devil has declared that he would buy up the armies and navies of the world with gold and silver, and thus with blood and terror he would rule the earth. Who owns the gold and silver of the world today? It is those who are now controlling the military armies, the politicians, and all the financiers of the world. They are 1. Stockpiling all the gold in their own vaults. 2. Creating depressions and inflation. 3. Robbing men of both their income and property through taxation. 4. Promoting wars among the nations. 5. Making and enforcing laws of the land against the inalienable rights and freedoms of man. 6. Controlling the movies, television, education, and the news media. 7. Promoting atheism and evolution. 8. Destroying morals, standards, and religion. 9. Promoting socialism and communism. 10. Forcing intermarriage among the races to develop a gray race. 11. Establishing a worldwide enslavement of all people. The devil has his disciples and apostles on earth. Some of them are in the camps of those who create wars, depressions and murders to gain power and wealth. They are master artisans of conspiracy, subversion and lies. In their power no man has personal or God-given rights, but rather they must serve them like slaves. Some of these intellectual bureaucrats are trying to create a one-world government, a kingdom of serfs without God and a people without freedom. But the Lord has plans to overthrow the work of the devil. The relief mine is one of them. Therefore, when that mine comes in, it will not only be a means for personal prosperity as many have wished, but it will also be the means of alleviating the sufferings and sorrow of millions of souls who have unknowingly put their trust in deceiving men and apostate governments. Modern Israel has assumed the speech, customs, and styles of the modern Babylonians. We are governed by their laws, traditions, and regulations. Indeed, we look and act like them, and have been influenced by their crimes, corruption, and wickedness. And to render additional offerings of subservience to their foreign gods, we have been taught to scatter among the nations, to observe and obey their strange laws. This has brought Israel into temporal and spiritual bondage. Through Isaiah, the Lord in his anguish cried, O my people, they which lead thee cause thee to err. Isaiah 3:12, because they regard not the work of the Lord, neither consider the operation of his hands. Therefore, my people are gone into captivity. Isaiah 5:12-13, because the priest and the prophet have erred, they err in vision, they stumble in judgment. Isaiah 28:7, but the Lord has promised that Israel would someday be let out of bondage by power, and with a stretched out arm. D&C 103:17. God's gold. The ancient prophets Isaiah and Micah were shown in vision one of the most remarkable events in the history of man. They beheld nations gathering to a mountain. In the spirit of prophecy they said, And it shall come to pass in the last days, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. Isaiah 2:2-3, Micah 4:1-2. How amazing that they saw a certain mountain that would be exalted above all the other mountains. Something would occur at this mountain that would cause many distressed people to flow to it. What would cause nations of people to leave their native lands and seek out this special mountain? Why would this mountain be classed as a part of God's house or kingdom? Why do these two prophets call it the mountain of the Lord? Joseph Smith once prophesied that the white horse will raise an ensign on the tops of the mountains of peace and safety. The white horse will find the mountains full of minerals and they will become very rich. You will see silver piled up in the streets. You will see gold shoveled up like sand. Gold will be of little value even in a mercantile capacity, for the people of the world will have something else to do in seeking for salvation. Peace will be taken from the earth, and there will be no peace only in the Rocky Mountains. You will be so numerous that you will be in danger of famine, but not for the want of seed time and harvest, but because of so many to be fed. Many will come with bundles under their arms to escape the calamities, and there will be no escape except by fleeing to Zion. The white horse PROPHECY. It is evident that the international conspirators are planning an economic collapse for all nations. Distressed people will come to those who have power to deliver them from their spiritual and temporal bondage. Only the values of gold will relieve them from such a calamity. No gold rush of the past will equal the flow of people that will come from all nations. The relief mine of the Lord shall be like an ensign to the nations, because it will assist them in gathering to Zion for peace and safety. In these last days there will be a separation of the wheat from the tares, the sheep from the goats or the righteous from the wicked. After that the Lord will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. King Nebuchadnezzar was also shown, in a dream, what would happen in the latter days. Daniel related the dream and its interpretation to the king, by saying, This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. Dan 2:31. He also saw a little stone that was cut out of the mountain. The stone soon became strong enough to break in pieces the terrible image. That which was cut out of the mountain shall be God's. With it shall come the power to break in pieces the great false and corrupt image of the beast. After that, God's kingdom shall reign over the earth. If the saints would have been worthy, Zion would have been redeemed, and the treasures from many mines would have already come into their hands. The Lord has always had riches in store sufficient, yea, even in abundance to redeem Zion and establish her waste places. D&C 101-75. But because of the failure of the saints to purchase the land of Zion, Orson Pratt prophesied, "Now, when the time comes for purchasing this land, we will have the means." How this means will be brought about, it is not for me to say. Perhaps the Lord will open up mines containing gold and silver, or in some other way as seemeth best. Wealth will be poured into the laps of the latter-day saints till they will scarcely know what to do with it. I will here again prophesy on the strength of former revelation, that there are no people now upon the face of the earth, not even excepting London, Paris, New York, or any of the great mercantile cities of the globe, there are no people now upon the face of the earth so rich as the latter-day saints will be in a few years to come. Having their millions, therefore they will purchase the land, build up cities, towns and villages, build a great capital city at headquarters, in Jackson County, Missouri. JD 21-135. With these riches in such tremendous amounts being poured into the hands of the latter-day saints, there will also come a great responsibility. This wealth must be used in the manner that is acceptable and pleasing to the Lord. It was explained to Coyle that there would be 4 major obligations for the stockholders: mining, milling, manufacturing, and minting, the 4 M's. Although these cover a very broad field, there would be very little that the stockholders would not be involved in, directly or indirectly. They would be responsible for managing almost every conceivable project and venture. The bishop had seen how many of these ancient prophecies would be fulfilled. Also, 2 angelic messengers spoke for an hour and a half, revealing information that was too powerful, too sacred for those who didn't want it, and who were unworthy of it anyway. Like the greater portion of the Book of Mormon, which was sealed, and too sacred for a people who were unappreciative of the lesser portion, so also will the power of these great riches be withheld from the unworthy. Milton once said, "They also serve who only stand and wait," and this is true for many faithful men today. Chosen men are waiting upon the Lord for His appointed time of deliverance. Rather than seek to systems of financial enterprises or establish themselves as some self-appointed individual, they choose to let God perform His strange act. Just as the 70 elders of Israel who remained atop the mountain fasting and praying to await the return of their Moses, so also the faithful elders of today must completely prepare themselves for the return of one like unto Moses. Anciently, most of the Israelites were dancing and reveling in the corrupt customs of the Egyptians, and now the same scene is being reenacted. But today all the nations of the earth are reveling in debauchery, sexual wickedness, drugs, atheism, and crime. Only a few faithful men are preparing for the coming of the Lord. But today more than ever before, men must stand up for God or be lost. They must defend their freedom, defend the sacred principles of the gospel, and protect those inalienable rights. It is a time of testing. It is all that men can do to prepare themselves to be worthy when the Lord shall come out of His hiding place. In the coming crisis, men will be required to be as valiant for God as any ancient prophet or apostle. Until that time, men must wait for the Lord to bring about the means of opening up the golden vaults of the dream mine. The Lord can create or move wealth very easily, and He can bless men with riches or take their wealth away from them. President Brigham Young said, "These treasures that are in the earth are carefully watched. They can be removed from place to place according to the good pleasure of Him who made them and owns them. He has His service, and it is just as easy for an angel to remove the minerals from any part of one of these mountains to another as it is for you and me to walk up and down this hall." This, however, is not understood by the Christian people. JD 1937. People do not know it, but I know there is a seal set upon the treasures of the earth. Men are allowed to go so far and no farther. I have known places where there were treasures in abundance, but could men get them? No. JD 1939. Even if there was not an ounce of gold in the dream mine, the Lord could put it there when it's supposed to be there. The riches of the earth are His to take or to give. He uses them to His own purpose and reason. He can change water to wine, multiply bread and fish, change a stick to a snake, or turn rocks to gold. Reason, logic and scientific evaluations may have little or nothing to do with the comprehension of God's work on earth. Noah's ark, Joseph's grain bins, Moses' rod, or Joseph's golden plates were objects for ridicule and scoffing, but to God they were a means of saving Israel. The work of God is foolishness to most men, and conversely, most of men's work is foolishness to God. God will open the vaults of the relief mine when He appoints the time, and He will open it up in the manner He chooses. This too was shown to Bishop Coyle in one of his last dreams. When it was time for the mine to turn out, he said, there would be a light-complexioned man with white hair, who would come from north of the mine with plenty of money to open the mine and finance the first shipment of ore. He seemed to be identified with the little spot of blue in the dark clouds over by the point of the mountain. The stockholders would rally with him and bring about many wonderful and amazing changes around the mine. During the mild open winter that would follow, the grain bins would be built, and beautiful White City would then have its beginning. The Dream Mine Story, Pierce, page 64. Bishop John Coyle's prophecies about the wars, the depressions and innumerable other events were only a hint of the great knowledge and power that shall accompany one of the greatest occurrences in the history of the world. The present story of the Dream Mine is only a preface to the world-shaking events that will develop through the Lot's handling of this sacred work. The relief mine has a great destiny. 1. It will be the means of bringing relief to the poor and hungry. 2. It will provide the means for gathering the house of Israel. 3. It will become another witness of how God protects and cares for his children if they are willing to obey him. 4. It will become another testimony to the Book of Mormon. 5. It will restore faith and confidence in God within men from many nations. 6. It will further establish testimony that God speaks to man. 7. It will rebuke the Pharisees and also prove the foolishness of the wisdom of men. 8. It will provide the means for men to live the united order in consecration. 9. It will give the saints the temporal power they need to withstand the enemies of God. 10. It will open the way for wealth to build up the New Jerusalem, the great temple of promise, and usher in the millennial reign of Christ on earth. Mormons are proud of their heritage. They built an empire out of a wilderness. They tamed the desert and the Indians. They fought off mobs and armies. Their faith saved them from famine and crickets. Through poverty, sweat and blood, they lived and died in a righteous faith. But their greatest accomplishments are yet in the future. Through the labors of good men and women shall the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham be fully realized. The latter-day saints shall give both temporal and spiritual salvation to the nations of the earth. To bring about happiness for all men of all nations, men must learn to live by the golden rule, rather than to rule with gold. President Brigham Young said, "It is the privilege of the saints to enjoy every good thing, for the earth and its fullness belong to the Lord, and he has promised all to his faithful saints. But it must be enjoyed without the spirit of lust, and in the spirit of the gospel. Then the sun will shine sweetly upon us. Each day will be filled with delight, and all things will be filled with beauty, giving joy, pleasure, and rest to the saints." JD 882. When Israel has been gathered, and the Lord is in their midst, then the corruptions of the wicked will have been purged out of Zion. The wealth of the mine will not only deliver the saints from bondage, but it will bring them into an untold prosperity. They shall be the richest people on earth. Men will learn a spiritual unity. Their lives will be dedicated to the Lord. The mission of the mine will then be changed from relief to beautification. In gratitude and devotion, men will once again pay adoration to their Lord, and gold will be used as it should to adorn his temples, his cities, and his kingdom.